King Tarquinius, accordingly, who had conferred not a few important benefits upon the Romans, died in the manner I have mentioned, after holding the sovereignty for 38 years, leaving 2 grandsons who were infants and 2 daughters already married. His son-in-law Tullius succeeded him in the sovereignty in the 4th year of the 50th Olympiad, the one in which Epitelides, a Lacedaemonian, won the short-distance foot race, and Archestratides was Archon at Athens. It is now the proper time to mention those particulars relating to Tullius which we at first omitted, namely, who his parents were, and what deeds he performed while he was yet a private citizen, before his accession to the sovereignty. Concerning his family, then, the account with which I can best agree is this. There lived at Corniculum, a city of the Latin nation, a man of the royal family named Tullius, who was married to Ocrisia, a woman far exceeding all the other women in Corniculum in beauty and modesty. When this city was taken by the Romans, Tullius himself was slain while fighting, and Ocrisia, then with child, was selected from the spoils and taken by King Tarquinius, who gave her to his wife. She, having been informed of everything that related to this woman, freed her soon afterwards, and continued to treat her with kindness and honour above all other women. While Ocrisia was as yet a slave, she bore a son, to whom, when he had left the nursery, she gave the name of Tullius from his father, as his proper and family name, and also that of Servius, as his common and first name, from her own condition, since she had been a slave when she had given birth to him. Servius, if translated into the Greek tongue, would be Julios, or servile. There is also current in the local records another story relating to his birth which raises the circumstances attending to the realm of the fabulous, and we have found it in many Roman histories. This account, if it be pleasing to the gods and the lesser divinities that it be related, is somewhat as follows. They say that from the hearth of the palace, on which the Romans offer various sacrifices and also consecrate the first portion of their meals, there rose up above the fire a man's privy member, and that Ocrisia was the first to see it as she was carrying the customary cakes to the fire, and immediately informed the king and queen of it. Tarquinius, they add, upon hearing this and left beholding the prodigy, was astonished, but Tanaquil, who was not only wise in other matters but also inferior to none of the Tyrrhenians in her knowledge of divination, told him it was ordained by fate that from the royal hearth should issue a scion superior to the race of mortals, to be born to the woman who should conceive by the phantom. And the other soothsayers affirming the same thing, the king thought it fitting that Ocrisia, to whom the prodigy had first appeared, should have intercourse with it. Thereupon this woman, having adorned herself as brides are usually adorned, was shut up alone in the room in which the prodigy had been seen, and one of the gods or lesser divinities, whether Vulcan as something or the tutelary deity of the house, having had intercourse with her and afterwards disappearing, she conceived and was delivered of Tullius at the proper time. This fabulous account, although it seems not altogether credible, is rendered less incredible by reason of another manifestation of the gods relating to Tullius, which was wonderful and extraordinary. For when he had fallen asleep one day while sitting in the portico of the palace about noon, a fire shone forth from his head. This was seen by his mother and by the king's wife as they were walking through the portico, as well as by all who happened to be present with them at that time. The flame continued to illuminate his whole head until his mother ran to him and awakened him, and with the ending of his sleep the flame was disappeared and vanished. Such are the accounts that are given of his birth. The memorable actions he performed before becoming king, in consideration of which Tarquinius admired him and the Roman people honoured him next to the king, are these. When scarcely more than a boy as yet, he was serving in the cavalry in the first campaign that Tarquinius undertook against the Tyrrhenians. He was thought to have fought so splendidly that he straightway became famous and received the prize of valour ahead of all others. Afterwards, when another expedition was undertaken against the same nation and a sharp battle was fought near the city of Aretum, he showed himself the bravest of all and was again crowned by the king as first in valour. And when he was about 20 years old, he was appointed to command the auxiliary forces sent by the Latins and assisted King Tarquinius in obtaining the sovereignty over the Tyrrhenians. In the first war that arose against the Sabines, being general of the horse, he put to flight that of the enemy, pursuing them as far as the city of Antemina, and again received the prize of valour because of this battle. He also took part in many other engagements against the same nation, sometimes commanding the horse and sometimes the foot, in all of which he showed himself a man of the greatest courage and was always the first to be crowned ahead of the others. And when that nation came to surrender themselves and deliver up their cities to the Romans, he was regarded by Tarquinius as the chief cause of his gaining this dominion also, and was crowned by him with the victor's crown. Moreover, he not only had the shrewdest understanding of public affairs, but was inferior to none in his ability to express his plans, and he possessed in an eminent degree the power of accommodating himself to every circumstance of fortune and to every kind of person. Because of these accomplishments, the Romans thought proper to transfer him by their votes from the plebeian to the patrician order, an honour they had previously conferred on Tarquinius and still earlier on Numa Pompilius. The king also made him his son-in-law, giving him one of his 2 daughters in marriage, and whatever business his infirmities or the age rendered him incapable of performing by himself, he ordered Tullius to transact, not only entrusting to him the private interests of his own family, but also asking him to manage the public business of the Commonwealth. In all these employments he was found faithful and just, and the people felt that it made no difference whether it was Tarquinius or Tullius who looked after the public affairs, so effectually had he won them to himself by the services he had rendered to them. This man, therefore, being endowed with a nature adequately equipped for command, and also supplied by fortune with many great opportunities for attaining it, believed, when Tarquinius died by the treachery of the sons of Ancius Marcius, who desired to recover their father's kingdom, as I have related in the preceding book, that he was called to the kingship by the very course of events, and so, being a man of action, he did not let the opportunity slip from his grasp. The person who helped him to seize possession of the supreme power and the author of all his good fortune was the wife of the deceased king, who aided him both because he was her son-in-law and also because she knew from many oracles that it was ordained by fate that this man should be the king of the Romans. It chanced that her son, a youth, had died shortly before, and that 2 infant sons were left by him. She therefore, reflecting on the desolation of her house, and being under the greatest apprehension lest, if the sons of Marcius possessed themselves of the sovereignty, they should destroy these infants and extirpate all of the royal family, first commanded that the gates of the palace should be shut, and guards stationed there with orders to allow no one to pass either in or out. Then, ordering all the rest to leave the room in which they had laid Tarquinius when he was at the point of death, she detained Ocrisia Tullius and her daughter who had married Tullius, and after ordering the children to be brought by their nurses, she spoke to them as follows: Our King Tarquinius, in whose name you received your nature and training, Tullius, and who honoured you above all his friends and relations, has finished his destined course, the victim of an impious crime, without having either made any disposition by will of his private interests, or left injunctions concerning the public business of the Commonwealth, and without having had it in his power even to embrace any of us and utter his last farewells. And these unhappy children are here left destitute and orphaned, and in imminent danger of their lives, for if the power falls into the hands of the Marsi, the murderers of their grandfather, they will be put to death by them in the most piteous manner. Even the lives of you men, to whom Tarquinius gave his daughters in preference to them, will not be safe, should his murderers obtain the sovereignty, any more than the lives of the rest of his friends and relations, or of us miserable women, but they will endeavour to destroy us all both openly and secretly. Bearing all this in mind, then, we must not permit the wicked murderers of Tarquinius and the enemies of us all to obtain so great power, and must oppose and prevent them, now by craft and deceit, since these means are necessary at present, but when our first attempts have succeeded, then coming to grips with them openly, with all our might and with arms, if those two shall be necessary. But they will not be necessary if we are willing to take the proper measures now. And what are these measures? Let us in the first place conceal the king's death and cause a report to be spread among the people that he has received no mortal wound, and let the physicians state that in a few days they will show him safe and sound. Then I will appear in public and will announce to the people, as if Tarquinius had so enjoined, that he had committed to one of his two son-in-laws, naming you, Tullius, the care and guardianship both of his private interests and of the public business until he is recovered of his wounds, and the Romans, far from being displeased, will be glad to see the state administered by you, who often have administered it already in the past. Then, when we have averted the present danger, for the power of our enemies will be at an end the moment the king is reported to be alive, do you assume the rods and the military power and summon before the people those who formed the plot to assassinate Tarquinius, beginning with the sons of Marcius, and cause them to stand trial, after you have punished all of these with death, if they submit to be tried, or with perpetual banishment and the confiscation of their estates, if they let their case go by default, which I think they will be more apt to do. Then at last set about establishing your government, win the affections of the people by kind affability, take great care that no injustice be committed, and gain the favour of the poor citizens by sundry benefactions and gifts. Afterwards, when we see a proper time, let us announce that Tarquinius is dead, and hold a public funeral for him. And as for you, Tullius, if you, who have been brought up and educated by us, have partaken of every advantage that sons receive from their mothers and fathers, and are married to our daughter, shall in addition actually become king of the Romans, it is but just, since I helped to win this also for you, that you should show all the kindness of a father to these little children, and when they come to manhood and are capable of handling public affairs, that you should appoint the elder to be the leader of the Romans. With these words she thrust each of the children in turn into the arms of both her son-in-law and her daughter, and roused great compassion in them both. Then, when it was the proper time, she went out of the room and ordered the servants to get everything ready for dressing the king's wounds, and to call the physicians. And letting that night pass, the next day, when the people flocked in great numbers to the palace, she appeared at the windows that gave upon the narrow street before the gates, and first informed them who the persons were who had plotted the murder of the king, and produced in chains those whom they had sent to commit the deed. Then, finding that many lamented the calamity and were angry at the authors of it, she at last told them that these men had gained naught from their wicked designs, since they had not been able to kill Tarquinius. This statement being received with universal joy, she then commended Tullius to them as the person appointed by the king to be the guardian of all his interests, both private and public, until he himself had recovered. The people therefore went away greatly rejoicing in the belief that the king had suffered no fatal injury, and continued for a long time in that opinion. Afterwards Tullius, attended by a strong body of men and taking along the king's lictors, went to the forum and caused proclamations to be made for the Marsi to appear and stand trial, and upon their failure to obey, he pronounced sentence of perpetual banishment against them, and having confiscated their property, he was now in secure possession of the sovereignty of Tarquinius. I shall interrupt the narration of what follows, that I may give the reasons which have induced me to disagree with Fabius and the rest of the historians who affirm that the children left by Tarquinius were his sons, to the end that none who have read these histories may suspect that I am inventing what I call them his grandsons, rather than his sons. For it is sheer heedlessness and indolence that has led these historians to publish that account of them without first examining any of the impossibilities and absurdities that are fatal to it. Each of these absurdities I will endeavour to point out in a few words. Tarquinius packed up and removed from Tyrrhenia with all his household at an age the most capable of reflection, for it is reported that he already aspired to take part in public life, to hold magistracies and to handle public affairs, and that he removed from there because he was not allowed to share in any position of honour in the state. Anyone else, then, might have assumed that he was at least in his 30th year when he left Tyrrhenia, since it is from this age onwards as a rule that the laws call to the magistracies and to the administration of public affairs those who desire such a career. But I will suppose him 5 whole years younger than this, and put him in his 25th year when he removed. Moreover, all the Roman historians agree that he brought with him a Tyrrhenian wife, whom he had married while his father was still alive, and he came to Rome in the 1st year of the reign of Ancus Marcius, as Gellius writes, but according to Licinius, in the 8th year. Grant, then, that he came in the year Licinius states and not before, for he could not have come after that time, since in the 9th year of the reign of Ancus he was sent by the king to command the cavalry in the war against the Latins, as both these historians state. Now, if he was not more than 25 years old when he came to Rome, and having been received into the friendship of Ancus, who was then king, in the 8th year of his reign, for Ancus reigned 24 years, and if he himself reigned 38, as all agree, he must have been 80 years old when he died, and this is the sum obtained by adding up the years. If his wife was 5 years younger, as may well be supposed, she was presumably in her 75th year when Tarquinius died. Accordingly, if she conceived her second and last son when she was in her 50th year, for at a more advanced age a woman no longer conceives, but this is itself the limit of her childbearing, as these authors write who have looked into these things. This son could not have been less than 25 years old when his father died, and Lucius the elder not less than 27, since the sons whom Tarquinius left by his wife could not have been infants. But surely if her sons had been grown men when their father died, it cannot be imagined either that their mother would have been so miserable a creature or so infatuated as to deprive her own children of the sovereignty their father had left them and bestow it upon an outsider, or the son of a slave woman, or again, that her sons themselves, when thus deprived of their father's sovereignty, would have borne the injustice in so abject and supine a manner, and that at an age when they were at the very height of their powers both of speech and action. For Tullius neither had the advantage of them in birth, being the son of a slave woman, nor excelled them much in the dignity of age, being only 3 years older than one of them, so that they would not willingly have yielded the kingship to them. This view involves some other absurdities too, of which all the Roman historians have been ignorant, with the exception of one whom I shall name presently. For it has been agreed that Tullius, having succeeded to the kingdom after the death of Tarquinius, held it for 44 years, so that if the eldest of the Tarquini was 27 years old when he was deprived of the sovereignty, he must have been about 70 when he killed Tullius. But he was then in the prime of life, according to the tradition handed down by the historians, and they state that he himself lifted up Tullius, and carrying him out of the Senate house, hurled him down the steps. His expulsion from the kingship happened in the 25th year after this, and in that same year he is represented as making war against the people of Ardea, and performing all the duties himself. But it is not reasonable to suppose that a man of 96 years old should be taking part in wars, and after his expulsion he still makes war against the Romans for no less than 14 years, being present himself, they say, at all engagements, which is contrary to all common sense. Thus, according to them, he must have lived about 110 years, but this length of life is not produced by our climates. Some of the Roman historians, being sensible of these absurdities, have endeavoured to solve them by means of yet other absurdities, alleging that not Tanaquil, but one Gagania, of whom no other account has come down to us, was the mother of the children. But here again, the marriage of Tarquinius is unseasonable, he being then very near 80 years old, and the begetting of children by a man of that age is incredible. Nor was he a childless man, who would wish by all means for children, for he had 2 daughters, and these already married. In light, therefore, of these various impossibilities and absurdities, I state that the children were not the sons but the grandsons of Tarquinius, agreeing therein with Lucius Piso, for he in his annals is the only historian who has given this account, unless indeed the children were the king's grandsons by birth and his sons by adoption, and this circumstance misled all of the other Roman historians. Now that these explanations have been made by way of preface, it is time to resume my narrative where it was broken off. When Tullius, after receiving the guardianship of the kingdom and expelling the faction of the Marsi, though he was now in secure possession of the sovereignty, he honoured King Tarquinius, as if he had but recently died of his wounds, with a very costly funeral, an imposing monument, and the other usual honours. And from that time, as guardian of the royal children, he took under his protection and care both their private fortunes and the public interests of the Commonwealth. The patricians, however, were not pleased with these proceedings, but felt indignation and resentment, being unwilling that Tullius should build up a kind of royal power for himself, without either a decree of the Senate or the other formalities prescribed by law. And the most powerful of them met together frequently and discussed with one another means of putting an end to his illegal rule. And they resolved that in the first time Tullius should assemble them in the Senate House, they would compel him to lay aside the rods and other symbols of royalty, and that after this was done they would appoint the magistrates called interexes, and through them choose a man to rule the state in accordance with the laws. While they were making these plans, Tullius, becoming aware of their purpose, applied himself to flattering and courting the poorer citizens, in the hopes of retaining the sovereignty through them, and having called an assembly of the people, he brought the children forward to the tribunal and delivered a speech somewhat as follows: I find myself under great obligation, citizens, to take care of these infant children. For Tarquinius, their grandfather, received me when I was fatherless and without a country, and brought me up, holding me in no respect inferior to his own children. He also gave me one of his 2 daughters in marriage, and during the whole course of his life continued to honour and love me, as you also know, with the same affection as if I had been his own son. And after that treacherous attack was made upon him, he entrusted me with the guardianship of these children in case he should suffer the fate of all mortals. Who therefore will think me pious towards the gods or just towards men if I abandon and betray the orphans to whom I owe so great a debt of gratitude? But to the best of my ability I shall neither betray the trust reposed in me nor yet abandon the children in their forlorn condition. You too ought in justice to remember the benefits their grandfather conferred upon the Commonwealth in reducing to your obedience so many cities of the Latins, your rivals for the sovereignty, in making all the Tyrrhenians, the most powerful of your neighbours, your subjects, and in forcing the Sabine nation to submit to you, all of which he effected at the cost of many great dangers. As long therefore as he himself was living, it became you to give him thanks for the benefits you had received from him, and now that he is dead, it becomes you to make grateful return to his posterity, and not to bury the remembrance of their deeds together with the person of your benefactors. Consider therefore that you have all jointly been left guardians of these little children, and confirm to them the sovereignty which their grandfather left them. For they would not receive so great an advantage from my guardianship, which is that of one man only, as from the joint assistance of you all. I have been compelled to say these things because I have perceived that some persons are conspiring against them and desire to hand the sovereignty over to others. I ask you, Romans, also to call to mind the struggles I have undergone in the interest of your supremacy, struggles neither inconsiderate nor few, which I need not relate to you who are familiar with them, and to repay to those little children the gratitude you owe me in return. For it has not been with a very view to securing a sovereignty of my own, of which, if that had been my aim, I was as worthy as anyone, but in order to aid the family of Tarquinius, that I have chosen to direct public affairs, and I entreat you as a supplicant not to abandon these orphans, who are now indeed only in danger of losing their sovereignty, but, if this first attempt of their enemies succeeds, will also be expelled from the city. But on this subject I need say no more to you, since you both know what is required and will perform your duty. Hear from me now the benefits I myself have arranged to confer upon you, and the reasons that induced me to summon this assembly. Those among you who already have debts which, through poverty, they are unable to discharge, I am eager to help, since they are citizens and have undergone many hardships in the service of their country. Hence, in order that these men who have securely established the common liberty may not be deprived of their own, I am giving them from my own means enough to pay their debts, and those who shall hereafter borrow I will not permit to be hauled to prison on account of their debts, but will make a law that no one shall lend money on the security of the persons of free men, for I hold that it is enough for the lenders to possess the property of those who contracted the debts. And in order to lighten for the future the burdens also of the war taxes you pay to the public treasury, by which the poor are oppressed and obliged to borrow, I will order all the citizens to give a valuation of their property, and everyone to pay his share of the taxes according to that valuation, as I learn is done in the greatest and best governed cities, for I regard it as both just and advantageous to the public that those who possess much should pay much in taxes, and those who have little should pay little. I also believe that the public lands, which you have obtained by your arms and now enjoy, should not as at present be held by those who are the most shameless, whether they got them by favour or acquired them by purchase, but by those among you who have no allotment of land, to the end that you, being free men, may not be serfs to others, or cultivate others' lands instead of your own. For a noble spirit cannot dwell in the breasts of men who are in want of the necessities of daily life. But above all these things I have determined to make the government fair and impartial, and justice the same for all and towards all. For some have reached that degree of presumption that they take upon themselves to maltreat the common people, and do not look upon the poor among you as being even free men, to the end, therefore, that the more powerful may receive justice from and do justice to their inferiors impartially. I will establish such laws as shall prevent violence and preserve justice, and I myself will never cease to take thought for the equality of all the citizens. While he was thus speaking, there was much praise from the assembly, some commending him for his loyalty and justice to his benefactors, others for his humanity and generosity to the poor, and still others for his moderation and democratic spirit towards those of humbler station, but all loved and admired him for being a lawful and just ruler. The assembly having been dismissed, during the following days he ordered lists to be made up of all the debtors who were unable to keep their pledges, with the amount each owed and the names of the creditors. And when this list had been delivered to him, he commanded tables to be placed in the forum, and in the presence of all the citizens counted out to the lenders the amount of the debts. Having finished with this, he published a royal edict commanding that all those who were enjoying the use of the public lands and holding them for their own should quit possession within a certain specified time, and that those citizens who had no allotment of land should give in their names to him. He also drew up laws, in some cases renewing old laws that had been introduced by Romulus and Numa Pompilius and had fallen into abeyance, and established others himself. While he was pursuing these measures, the patricians were growing indignant as they saw the power of the Senate being overthrown, and they proceeded to plan an action which was no longer the same as before but the opposite. For whereas at first they had determined to deprive him of his illegal power to appoint interexes, and through them to choose one who should hold the office legally, they now thought that they ought to acquiesce in the existing state of affairs and not to interfere at all, for it occurred to them that if the Senate attempted to place a man of its own choosing at the head of affairs, the people, when they came to give their votes, would oppose him, whereas if they should leave the choice of the king to the people, all the curia would elect Tullius, and the result would be that he would seem to hold the office legally. They thought it better, therefore, to permit him to continue in the possession of the sovereignty by stealth and by deceiving the citizens rather than after persuading them and receiving it openly. But none of their calculations availed them aught, so artfully did Tullius outmanoeuvre them and get possession of the royal power against their will, for having long before caused a report to be spread through the city that the patricians were plotting against him, he came into the forum meanly dressed and with a dejected countenance, accompanied by his mother Ocrisia, Tanaquil, the wife of Tarquinius, and all of the royal family, and when great crowds flocked together at so unexpected a sight, he called an assembly and ascending the tribunal addressed them much as follows: "It is no longer the children of Tarquinius alone whom I see in danger of suffering some injury at the hands of their enemies, but I am already coming to fear for my own life, lest I receive a bitter requital for my justice. For the patricians are plotting against me, and I have received information that some of them are conspiring to kill me, not because they can charge me with any crime, great or trivial, but because they resent the benefits I have conferred and am preparing to confer upon the people, and feel that they are being treated unjustly. The moneylenders, for their part, feel aggrieved, because I did not permit the poor among you to be hauled to prison by them because of their debts, and to be deprived of their liberty. And those who misappropriate and hold what belongs to the state, finding themselves obliged to give up the land which you acquired by your blood, are as angry as if they were being deprived of their inheritances, instead of merely restoring what belongs to others. Those again who have been exempt from war taxes resent being compelled to give in a valuation of their property and to pay taxes in proportion to those valuations. But the general complaint of them all is that they will have to accustom themselves to live according to written laws, and impartially dispense justice to you and receive it from you, instead of abusing the poor, as they do now, as if they were so many purchased slaves. And making common cause of these complaints, they have taken counsel and sworn to recall all the exiles, and to restore the kingdom to Marcius' sons, against whom you passed a vote forbidding them to use fire and water, for having assassinated Tarquinius, your king, a worthy man and a lover of his country, and after they had committed such an act of pollution, for having failed to appear for their trial, and thus condemned themselves to exile. And if I had not received early information of these designs, they would, with the assistance of a foreign force, have brought back the exiles into the city in the dead of night. You all know, of course, what would have been the consequence of this, even if without my mentioning it, that the Marsi, with the support of the patricians, after getting control of affairs without any trouble, would first have seized me as the guardian of the royal family, and as the person who had pronounced sentence against them, and after that would have destroyed these children and all the other kinsmen and friends of Tarquinius, and as they have much of the savage and the tyrant in their nature, they would have treated our wives, mothers, and daughters, and all the female sex as their slaves. If therefore it is your pleasure also, citizens, to recall the assassins and make them kings, to banish the sons of your benefactors, and to deprive them of the kingdom their grandfather left them, we shall submit to our fate. But we all, together with our wives and children, make supplication to you, by all the gods and lesser divinities who watch over the lives of men, that, in return for the many benefits Tarquinius, the grandfather of these children, never ceased to confer upon you, and in return for the many services I myself, as far as I have been able, have done to you, you will grant us this single boon, to declare your own sentiments. For if you have come to believe that any others are more worthy than we of this honour, the children with all the other relations of Tarquinius shall withdraw, leaving the city to you. As for me, I shall take a more generous resolution in my own case, for I have already lived long enough both for virtue and for glory, and if I am disappointed of your goodwill, which I have preferred to every other good thing, I could never bring myself to live in disgrace among any other people. Take the rods, then, and give them to the patricians, if you wish. I shall not trouble you with my presence." While he was speaking these words and seemed about to leave the tribunal, they all raised a tremendous clamour and mingled tears with their entreaties, beseeching him to remain and to retain control of affairs, fearing no one. Thereupon some of the partisans of Servilius, who had stationed themselves in different parts of the forum, following his instructions, cried out, "Make him king," and demanded that the curia should be called together and a vote taken, and after these had set the example, the whole populace was promptly of the same opinion. Tullius, seeing this, no longer let the occasion slip, but told them that he felt very grateful to them for remembering his services, and after promising to confer even more benefits if they should make him king, he appointed a day for the election, at which he ordered everybody to be present, including those from the country. When the people had assembled, he called the curia and took the vote of each curia separately, and upon being judged worthy of the kingship by all the curia, he then accepted it from the populace, telling the senate to go hang, for he did not ask that the body ratify the decision of the people, as it was accustomed to do. After coming to the sovereignty in this manner, he introduced many reforms to the civil administration, and also carried on a great and memorable war against the Tyrrhenians. But I shall first give an account of his administrative reforms. Immediately upon receiving the sovereignty, he divided the public lands among those of the Romans who served others for hire. Then he caused both the laws relating to private contracts and those concerning torts to be ratified by the curia. These laws were about 50 in number, of which I need not make any mention at present. He also added 2 hills to the city, those called the Viminal and the Esquiline, each of which has the size of a fairly large city. These he divided among such of the Romans as had no homes of their own, so that they might build houses there, and he himself fixed his habitation there, in the best part of the Esquiline hill. This king was the last who enlarged the circuit of the city by adding these 2 hills to the other 5, after he had first consulted the auspices, as the law directed, and performed the other religious rites. Further than this, the buildings of the city have not yet progressed, since the gods, they say, have not permitted it. But all the inhabited places around it, which are many and large, are unprotected and without walls, and very easily are taken by any enemies who may come. If anyone wishes to estimate the size of Rome by looking at these suburbs, he will necessarily be misled for want of a definite clue by which to determine up to what point it is still the city, and where it ceases to be the city, so closely is the city connected with the country, giving the beholder the impression of a city stretching out indefinitely. But if one should wish to measure Rome by the wall, which, though hard to be discovered by reason of the buildings that surround it in many places, yet preserves in several parts of it some trace of its ancient structure, and to compare it with the circuit of the city of Athens, the circuit of Rome would not seem to him very much larger than the other, but for an account of the extent and beauty of the city of Rome as it existed in my day, other occasions will be more suitable. After Tullius had surrounded the 7 hills with 1 wall, he divided the city into 4 regions, which he named after the hills, calling the first the Palatine, the second the Suburban, the third the Colline, and the fourth the Esquiline regions, and by this means he made the city contain 4 tribes, whereas it previously had consisted of but 3, and he ordered that the citizens inhabiting each of the 4 regions should, like persons living in villages, neither take up another abode nor be enrolled elsewhere, and the levies of troops, the collection of taxes for military purposes, and the other services which every citizen was bound to offer to the Commonwealth, he no longer based upon the 3 national tribes, as before, but upon the 4 local tribes established by himself, and over each region he appointed commanders, like heads of tribes or villages, whom he ordered to know what house each man lived in. After this he commanded that there should be erected in every street by the inhabitants of the neighbourhood chapels to heroes whom statues stood in front of the houses, and he made a law that sacrifices should be performed to them every year, each family contributing a honey cake. He directed also that the persons attending and assisting those who performed the sacrifices at these shrines on behalf of the neighbourhood should not be free men but slaves, the ministry of servants being looked upon as pleasing to the heroes. The festival of the Romans still continued to celebrate, even in my day, in the most solemn and sumptuous manner a few days after the Saturnalia, calling it the Compitalia, after the streets, for competi is their name for streets, and they still observe the ancient custom in connection with those sacrifices, appropriating the heroes by the ministry of their servants, and during these days removing every badge of their servitude in order that the slaves, being softened by this instance of humanity, which has something great and solemn about it, may make themselves more agreeable to their masters, and be less sensible of the servility of their condition. Tullius also divided the country as a whole into 26 parts, according to Fabius, who calls these divisions tribes also, and, adding the 4 city tribes to them, says that there were 30 tribes in all under Tullius, but according to Venonius, he divided the country into 31 parts, so that with the 4 city tribes the number was rounded out to the 35 tribes that exist down to our own day. However, Cato, who is more worthy of credence than either of these authors, does not specify the number of the parts into which the country was divided, after Tullius therefore had divided the country into a certain number of parts. Whatever that number may be, he built places of refuge upon such lofty eminences as could afford ample security for the husbandman, and called them by a Greek name, Pagi, or hills. Thither all the inhabitants fled from the fields whenever a raid was made by enemies, and generally passed the night there. These places also had their governors, whose duty it was to know not only the names of all the husbandmen who belonged to the same district, but also the lands which afforded them their livelihood, and whenever there was occasion to summon the countrymen to take arms or to collect the taxes that were assessed against each of them, these governors assembled the men together and collected the money, and in order that the number of these husbandmen might not be hard to ascertain, but might be easy to compute and be known at once, he ordered them to erect altars to the gods who presided over and were guardians of the district, and directed them to assemble every year and honour these gods with public sacrifices. This occasion also he made one of the most solemn festivals, calling it the Paginalia, and he drew up laws concerning these sacrifices which the Romans still observe. Towards the expense of this sacrifice and of the assemblage he ordered all those of the same district to contribute each of them a certain piece of money, the men paying one kind, the women another, and the children a third kind. When these pieces of money were counted by those who presided over the sacrifice, the number of people distinguished by their sex and age became known. And wishing also, as Lucius Piso writes in the first book of his Annals, to know the number of the inhabitants of the city, and of all who were born and died and arrived at the age of manhood, he prescribed the piece of money which their relations were to pay for each into the treasury of Ithia, called by the Romans Juno Lucina, for those who were born into that of the Venus of the Grove, called by them Libitina, of those who died, and into the treasury of the Juventas for those who were arriving at manhood, By means of these pieces of money he would know every year both the number of all the inhabitants and which of them were of military age. After he had made these regulations, he ordered all the Romans to register their names and give in a monetary valuation of their property, and at the same time taking the oath required by law that they had given in a true valuation in good faith. They were also to set down the names of their fathers with their own age, and the names of their wives and children, and every man was to declare in what tribe of the city or in what district of the country he lived. If any failed to give their valuation, the penalty he established was that their property should be forfeited, and they themselves should be whipped and sold into slavery. This law continued in force among the Romans for a long time. After all had given in their valuations, Tullius took the registers and the sizes of their estates, introduced the wisest of all measures, and one which has been the source of the greatest advantage to the Romans, as the results have shown. The measure was this: he selected from the whole number of the citizens one part, consisting of those whose property was rated the highest, and amounted to no less than 100 minae. Of these he formed 80 centuries, whom he ordered to be armed with argolic bucklers, with spears, brazen helmets, corslets, greaves, and swords. Dividing these centuries into two groups, he made 40 centuries of younger men, whom he appointed to take the field in times of war, and 40 of older men, whose duty it was, when the youth went forth to war, to remain in the city and guard everything inside the walls. This was the first class. In wars it occupied a position in the forefront of the whole army. Next from these who were left he took another part, whose rating was under 10,000 drachma, but not less than 75 minae. Of these he formed 20 centuries and ordered them to wear the same armour as those of the first class, except that he took from them the corslets, and instead of the bucklers he gave them shields. Here also he distinguished between those who were over 45 years of age and those who were of military age, consisting of 10 centuries of the younger men whose duty it was to serve their country in the field, and 10 of the older, to whom he committed the defence of the walls. This was the second class. In engagements they were drawn up behind those fighting in the front ranks. The third class he constituted out of those who were left, taking such as had a rating of less than 7,500 drachma, but not less than 50 minae. The armour of these he diminished not only by taking away the corslets as from the second class, but also the greaves. He formed likewise 20 centuries of these, dividing them like the former according to their age, and assigning 10 centuries of the younger men and 10 to the older. In battles, the posts and stations of these centuries was in the third line from the front. Again, taking from the remainder those whose property amounted to less than 5,000 drachma, but was as much as 25 minae, he formed a fourth class. This he also divided into 20 centuries, 10 of which he composed of such as were in the vigour of their age, and the other 10 of those who were just past it, in the same manner as with the former classes. He ordered the arms of these to be shields, swords, and spears, and their post in engagements to be in the last line. The fifth class, consisting of those whose property was between 25 minae and 12 minae and a half, he divided into 30 centuries. These were also distinguished according to their age, 15 of the centuries being comprised of older men and 15 of the younger. These he armed with javelins and slings and placed outside the line of battle. He ordered 4 unarmed centuries to follow those who were armed, 2 of them consisting of armourers and carpenters, and of those whose business it was to prepare everything that might be of use in times of war, and the other 2 of trumpeters and hornblowers, and such as sounded the various calls with any other instrument. The artisans were attached to the second class and divided according to their age, one of their centuries following the older centuries, and the other the younger centuries. The trumpeters and hornblowers were added to the fourth class, and one of their centuries also consisted of the older men, and the other of the younger. Out of all the centuries the bravest men were chosen as centurions, and each of these commanders took care that his century should yield a ready obedience to orders. This was the arrangement he made of the entire infantry, consisting of both the heavy-armed and light-armed troops. As for the cavalry, he chose them out of such as had the highest rating and were of distinguished birth, forming 18 centuries of them, and added them to the first 80 centuries of the heavy-armed infantry. These centuries of cavalry were also commanded by persons of the greatest distinction. The rest of the citizens who had a rating of less than 12 minae and a half, but were more numerous than those already mentioned, he put in a single century and exempted them from service in the army and from every sort of tax. Thus there were 6 divisions which the Romans call classes, by a slight change of the Greek word klesis, for the verb which we Greeks pronounce in the imperative mode klei, the Romans call kala, and the classes they anciently call classes, and the centuries included in these divisions amounted to 193. The first class contained 98 centuries, counting the cavalry, the second 22, counting the artificers, the third 20, the fourth again contained 22, counting the trumpeters and hornblowers, and the fifth 30, and the last of all 1 century, consisting of the poorer citizens. In pursuance of this arrangement, he levied troops according to the division of the centuries, and imposed taxes in proportion to the valuation of their possessions. For instance, whenever he had occasion to raise 10,000 men, or if it should so happen 20,000, he would divide that number among the 193 centuries, and then order each century to furnish the number of men that fell to its share. As to the expenditures that would be needed for the provisioning of soldiers while on duty and for the various warlike supplies, he would first calculate how much money would be sufficient, and having in like manner divided that sum among the 193 centuries, he would order every man to pay his share towards it in proportion to his property. Thus it happened that those who had the largest possessions, being fewer in number but distributed into more centuries, were obliged to serve oftener and without any intermission, and to pay greater taxes than the rest, and those who had small and moderate possessions, being more numerous but distributed into fewer centuries, served seldom in rotation, and paid small taxes, and that those whose possessions were not sufficient to maintain them were exempt from all burdens. Tullius made none of these regulations without reason, but from the conviction that all men look upon their possessions as the prize at stake in war, and that it is for the sake of retaining these that they all endure its hardships. He thought it right, therefore, that those who had the greater prize at stake should suffer greater hardship, both with their persons and with their possessions, and those who had less at stake should be burdened less in respect of both, and that those who had no loss to fear should endure no hardships, but be exempt from taxes by reason of their poverty and from military service, because they paid no tax. For at that time the Romans received no pay as soldiers from the public treasury, but served at their own expense. Accordingly, he did not think it right either that those should pay taxes who were so far from having wherewithal to pay them that they were in want of the necessities of daily life, or that such as contributed nothing to the public taxes should, like mercenary troops, be maintained in the field at the expense of others. Having by this means laid upon the rich the whole burden of both the dangers and expenses, and observing that they had discontented, he contrived by another method to relieve their uneasiness and mitigate their resentment, by granting to them an advantage which would make them complete masters of the commonwealth, while he excluded the poor from any part in the government, and he effected this without the plebeians noticing it. This advantage that he gave to the rich related to the assemblies where the matters of the greatest moment were ratified by the people. I have already said before that by the ancient laws the people had control over the 3 most important and vital matters. They elected the magistrates both civil and military, they sanctioned and repealed laws, and they declared war and made peace. In discussing and deciding these matters, they voted by curia, and citizens of the smallest means had an equal vote with those of the greatest. but as the rich were few in number, as may well be supposed, and the poor much more numerous, the later carried everything by a majority of votes. Tullius, observing this, transferred this preponderance of votes from the poor to the rich, for whenever he thought proper to have magistrates elected, a law considered, or war to be declared, he assembled the people by centuries instead of curia. And the first centuries that he called to express their opinion were those with the highest rating, consisting of the 18 centuries of cavalry and the 80 centuries of infantry. As these centuries amounted to 3 more than all the rest together, if they agreed, they prevailed over the others, and the matter was decided. But in cases where these were not all of the same mind, he then called the 22 centuries of the second class, and if the votes were still divided, he called the centuries of the third class, and, in the fourth place, those of the fourth class, and this he continued to do until 97 centuries concurred in the same opinion. And if after the calling of the fifth class this had not yet happened, but the opinions of the 192 centuries were equally divided, he then called the last century, consisting of the mass of the citizens who were poor, and for that reason exempt from all military service and taxes, and whichever side this century joined, that side carried the day, but this seldom happened, and was next to impossible. Generally, the question was determined by calling the first class, and it rarely went as far as the fourth, so that the fifth and the last were superfluous. In establishing this political system, which gave so great an advantage to the rich, Tullius outwitted the people, as I said, without their noticing it, and excluded the poor from any part in public affairs. For they all thought that they had an equal share in the government, because every man was asked his opinion, each in his own century. But they were deceived in this, that the whole century, whether it consisted of a small or a very large number of citizens, had but one vote, and also in that the centuries which voted first consisting of men of the highest rating, though they were more in number than all the rest, yet contained fewer citizens, but above all, in that the poor, who were very numerous, had but one vote, and were the last called. When this had been brought about, the rich, though paying out large sums and exposed without intermission to the dangers of war, were less inclined to feel aggravated now that they had obtained control of the most important matters and had taken the whole power out of the hands of those who were not performing the same services, and the poor, who had but the slightest share in the government, finding themselves exempt both from taxes and military service, prudently and quietly submitted to this diminution of their power, and the Commonwealth itself, for the advantage of seeing the same persons who were to deliberate concerning its interests, allotted the greatest share of the dangers, and ready to do whatever required to be done. This form of government was maintained by the Romans for many generations, but is altered in our times and changed to be more democratic, some urgent needs having forced the change, which was effected not by abolishing the centuries, but by no longer observing the strict ancient manner of calling them, a fact which I myself have noted, having often been present at the election of their magistrates, but this is not the proper occasion to discuss these matters. Thereupon Tullius, having completed the business of the census, commanded all the citizens to assemble in arms in the largest field before the city, and having drawn up the horse in their respective squadrons and the foot in their massed ranks, and placed the light-armed troops each in their own centuries, he performed an expiatory sacrifice for them with a bull, a ram, and a boar. These victims he ordered to be led 3 times around the army, and then sacrificed them to Mars, to whom that field is consecrated. The Romans are to this day purified by this same expiatory sacrifice, after the completion of each census, by those who are invested with the most sacred magistracy, and they call the purification a lustrum. The number of all the Romans who then gave in a valuation of their possessions was, as appears by the census records, 84,700. The king also took no small care to enlarge the body of citizens, hitting upon a method that has been overlooked by all the kings before him, for they by receiving foreigners and bestowing upon them equal rights of citizenship without rejecting any, whatever their birth or condition, had indeed rendered the city populous, but Tullius permitted even manumitted slaves to enjoy these same rights, unless they chose to return to their own countries, for he ordered these also to report the value of their property at the same time as the other free men, and he distributed them among the 4 city tribes, in which the body of freedmen, however numerous, continued to be ranked even to my day, and he permitted them to share in all the privileges which were open to the rest of the plebeians. The patricians being displeased and indignant at this, he called an assembly of the people and told them that he wondered at those who were displeased at his course, first for thinking that free men differed from slaves by their very nature rather than by their condition, and second, for not determining by men's habits and character, rather than by the accident of their fortune, those who were worthy of honours, particularly when they saw how unstable a thing good fortune is, and how subject to sudden change, and how difficult it is for anyone, even the most fortunate, to say how long it will remain with him. He asked them also to consider how many states, both barbarian and Greek, had passed from slavery to freedom, and how many from freedom to slavery. He called it great folly on their part if, after they had granted liberty to such of their slaves as deserved it, they envied them the rights of citizens, and he advised them, if they thought them bad men, not to make them free, and if good men, not to ignore them because they were foreigners. He declared that they were doing an absurd and stupid thing if, while permitting all strangers to share the rights of citizenship without distinguishing their condition or inquiring closely whether any of them had been manumitted or not, they regarded such as had been slaves among themselves as unworthy of this favour. And he said that, though they thought themselves wiser than other people, they did not even see what lay at their very feet, and was to be observed every day, and what was clear to the most ordinary men, namely, that not only the masters would take great care not to manumit any of their slaves rashly, for fear of granting the greatest of human blessings indiscriminately, but the slaves too would be more zealous to observe their masters faithfully, when they knew that if they were thought worthy of liberty, they should presently become citizens of a great and flourishing state, and receive both these blessings from their masters. He concluded by speaking of the advantages that would result from this policy, reminding those who understood such matters and informing the ignorant that to a state which aimed at supremacy and thought itself worthy of great things, nothing was so essential as a large population, in order that it might be equal to carrying on all its wars with its own armed forces, and might not exhaust itself as well as its wealth by hiring mercenary troops. And for this reason, he said, the former kings had granted citizenship to all foreigners, but if they enacted this law also, great numbers of youths would be reared from those who were manumitted, and the state would never lack for armed forces of its own, but would always have sufficient troops, even if it should be forced to make war against all the world. And beside this advantage to the public, the richest men would privately receive many benefits if they permitted the freedmen to share in the government, since in the assemblies and in the voting and in the other acts as citizens, they would receive their rewards in the very situations in which they most needed it, and furthermore, would be leaving the children of these freedmen as so many clients to their posterity. These arguments of Tullius induced the patricians to permit this custom to be introduced into the Commonwealth, and to this day it continues to be observed by the Romans as one of their sacred and unalterable laws. Now that I have come to this part of my narrative, I think it necessary to give an account of the customs which at that time prevailed among the Romans with regard to slaves, in order that no one may accuse either the king who first undertook to make citizens of those who had been slaves, or the Romans who accepted the law, of recklessly abandoning their noble traditions. The Romans acquired their slaves by the most just means, for they either purchased them from the state at an auction as part of the spoils, or the general permitted the soldiers to keep the prisoners they had taken together with the rest of the booty, or else they bought them of those who had obtained possession of them by these same means. So that neither Tullius, who established this custom, nor those who received and maintained thought they were doing anything dishonourable or detrimental to the public interest, if those who had lost both their country and their liberty in war, and had proved loyal to those who had enslaved them, or to those who had purchased them from these, had both these blessings restored to them by their masters. Most of these slaves obtained their liberty as a free gift because of meritorious conduct, and this was the best kind of discharge from their masters, but a few paid a ransom raised by lawful and honest labour. This, however, is not the case in our day, but things have come to such a state of confusion, and the noble traditions of the Roman Commonwealth have become so debased and sullied, that some who have made a fortune by robbery, housebreaking, prostitution, and every other base means, purchase their freedom with the money so acquired, and straightway are Romans. Others who have been confidants and accomplices of their masters in poisonings receive from them this favour as their reward. Some are freed in order that, when they have received the monthly allowance of corn given by the public or some other largesse distributed by the men in power to the poor among the citizens, they may bring it to those who granted them their freedom, and others owe their freedom to the levity of their masters, and to their vain thirst for popularity. I at any rate know of some who have allowed all of their slaves to be freed after their death, in order that they might be called good men when they were dead, and that many people might follow their biers wearing their liberty caps. Indeed, some of those taking part in these processions, as one might have heard from those who knew, have been malefactors just out of jail, who had committed crimes deserving 1,000 deaths. Most people, nevertheless, as they look upon these stains that can scarce be washed away from the city, are grieved and condemn the custom, looking upon it as unseemly that a dominant city, which aspires to rule the whole world, should make such men citizens. One might justly condemn many other customs also which were wisely devised by the ancients, but are shamefully abused by the men of today. Yet, for my part, I do not believe that this law ought to be abolished, lest as a result some greater evil should break out to the detriment of the public. But I do say that it ought to be amended as far as possible, and that great reproaches and disgraces hard to be wiped out should not be permitted entrance into the body politic. And I could wish that the censors preferably, or if that may not be the case, then the consuls would take it upon themselves to take care of this matter, since it requires the control of some sort of magistracy, and that they would make inquiries into the persons who are freed each year, who they are, and for what reason they have been freed and how, just as they inquire into the lives of the knights and senators, after which they should enrol in the tribes such of them as they find worthy to be citizens, and allow them to remain in the city, but should expel from the city the foul and corrupt, under the specious pretence of sending them out as a colony. These are the things, then, which, as the subject required it, I thought it both necessary and just to say to those who censure the customs of the Romans. Tullius showed himself a friend to the people, not only in these measures by which he seemed to lessen the authority of the Senate and the power of the patricians, but also in those by which he diminished the royal power, of half of which he deprived himself. For whereas the kings before him had thought it proper to have all cases brought before them, and had determined all suits both private and public, as they themselves thought fit, he, making a distinction between public and private suits, took cognizance himself of all crimes which affected the public, but in private cases appointed private persons to be judges, prescribing for them as norms and standards the laws which he himself had established. When he had arranged affairs in the city in the best manner, he conceived a desire to perpetuate his memory with posterity by some illustrious enterprise. And upon turning his attention to the monuments both of ancient kings and statesmen by which they had gained reputation and glory, he did not envy either that Assyrian woman for having built the walls of Babylon, or the kings of Egypt for having raised the pyramids at Memphis, or any other prince for whatever monument he might have erected as a display of his riches, or of the multitude of workmen at his command. On the contrary, he regarded all these things as trivial and ephemeral and unworthy of serious attention, mere beguilements for the eyes, but no real aids to the conduct of life, or to the administration of public affairs, since they led to nothing more than a reputation for great felicity on the part of those who had built them. But the things that he regarded as worthy of praise and emulation were the works of the mind, the advantages from which are enjoyed by the greatest number of people and for the greatest length of time. And of all the achievements of this nature he admired most the plan of Amphictyon, the son of Helen, who, seeing the Greek nation weak and easy to be destroyed by the barbarians who surrounded them, brought them together in a great council and assemblage of the whole nation, named after him the Amphictyonic Council, and then, apart from the particular laws by which each city was governed, established others common to all, which they call the Amphictyonic laws, in consequence of which they lived in mutual friendship and fulfilling the obligations of kinship by their actions rather than by their professions, continued troublesome and formidable neighbours to the barbarians. His example was followed by the Ionians who, leaving Europe, settled in the maritime parts of Caria, and also by the Dorians, who built their cities in the same region and erected temples at the common expense, the Ionians building the temple of Diana at Ephesus, and the Dorians that of Apollo at Triopium, where they assembled with their wives and children at the appointed times, joined together in sacrificing and celebrating the festival, engaged in various contests, equestrian, gymnastic, and musical, and made joint offerings to the gods. After they had witnessed the spectacles, celebrated the festivals, and received the other evidences of goodwill from one another, if any difference had arisen between one city and another, arbiters sat in judgment and decided the controversy, and they also consulted together concerning the means both of carrying on the war against the barbarians and of maintaining the mutual concord. These and the like examples inspired Tullius also with a deep desire of bringing together and uniting all the cities belonging to the Latin race, so that they might not, as the result of engaging in strife at home and in wars with one another, be deprived of their liberty by the neighbouring barbarians. After he had taken this resolution, he called together the most important men of every city, stating that he was summoning them to take counsel with him about matters of great consequence and of mutual concern. When they had assembled, he caused the Roman Senate and these men who came from the cities to meet together, and made a long speech exhorting them to concord, pointing out what a fine thing it was when a number of states agree together, and what a disgraceful sight when kinsmen are at variance, and declaring that concord is a source of strength to weak states, while mutual slaughter reduces and weakens even the strongest. After this he went on to show them that the Latins ought to have the command over the neighbours, and, being Greeks, ought to give laws to barbarians, and that the Romans ought to have the leadership of all the Latins, not only because they excelled in the size of their city and the greatness of their achievements, but also because they, more than the others, had enjoyed the favour of divine providence, and in consequence had attained to so great eminence. Having said this, he advised them to build a temple of refuge at Rome at their joint expense, to which the cities should repair every year, and offer up sacrifices both individually and in common, and also celebrate festivals at such times as they should appoint, and if any differences should arise between these cities, they should terminate it over the sacrifice, submitting their complaints to the rest of the cities for decision. By enlarging upon these and their many other advantages they would reap from the appointment of a general council, he prevailed on all who were present at the session to give their consent. And later, with the money contributed by all the cities, he built the Temple of Diana, which stands upon the Aventine Hill, the largest of all the hills in Rome, and he drew up laws relating to the mutual rights of the cities and prescribed the manner in which everything else that concerned the festival and the general assembly should be performed. And to the end that no lapse of time should obliterate these laws, he erected a bronze pillar upon which he engraved both the decrees of the council and the names of the cities which had taken part in it. This pillar still exists down to my time in the Temple of Diana, with the inscription in the characters that were anciently used in Greece. This alone would serve as no slight proof that the founders of Rome were not barbarians, for if they had been, they would not have used Greek characters. These are the most important and most conspicuous administrative measures that are recorded of this king, beside many others of no less note and certainty. His military operations were directed against one nation only, that of the Tyrrhenians. Of these I shall now give an account. After the death of Tarquinius, these cities which had yielded the sovereignty to him refused to observe the terms of their treaties any longer, disdaining to submit to Tullius since he was a man of lowly birth, and anticipating great advantages for themselves from the discord that had arisen between the patricians and the ruler. The people called the Veientes were the leaders of the revolt, and when Tullius sent ambassadors they replied that they had no treaty with him, either concerning their yielding the sovereignty or concerning friendship and an alliance. These having set the example, the people of Caere and Tarquini followed it, and at last all of Tyrrhenia was up in arms. This war lasted for 20 years without intermission, during which time both sides made many irruptions into one another's territories with great armies, and fought one pitched battle after another. But Tullius, after being successful in all the battles in which he engaged, both against the several cities and against the whole nation, and after being honoured with 3 most splendid triumphs, at last forced those who refused to be ruled to accept the yoke against their will. In the 20th year, therefore, the 12 cities, having become exhausted by the war both in men and in money, again met together and decided to yield the sovereignty to the Romans upon the same terms as previously. And so the men chosen as envoys from each city arrived with the tokens as supplicants, and entrusting their cities to Tullius begged of him not to adopt any extreme measure against them. Tullius told them that because of their folly and their impiety towards the gods whom they had made sponsors of their treaties, only to violate their agreements afterwards, they deserved many severe punishments, but that since you acknowledged their fault and were coming with the fillets of supplicants and with entreaties to deprecate the resentment they had merited, they should fail of none of the clemency and moderation of the Romans at this time. Having said this, he put an end to the war against them, and in the case of most of the cities, without imposing any conditions or harbouring any resentment for past injuries, he permitted them to retain the same government as before, and also to enjoy their own possessions, as long as they should abide by the treaties made with them by Tarquinius. But in the case of the 3 cities of Caere, Tarquini, and Veii, which had not only begun the revolt but had also induced the rest to make war upon the Romans, he punished them by seizing a part of their lands, which he portioned out among those who had lately been added to the body of Roman citizens. Beside these achievements in both peace and war, he built 2 temples to Fortune which seemed to have favoured him all his life, one in the market called the Cattle Market, and the other at the banks of the Tiber to the Fortune which he named Fortune Virilis, as she is called by the Romans even to this day, and being now advanced in years and not far from a natural death, he was treacherously slain by Tarquinius, his son-in-law, and by his own daughter. I shall also relate the manner in which this treacherous deed was carried out, but first I must go back and mention a few things that preceded it. Tullius had 2 daughters by his wife Tarquinia, whom King Tarquinius had given him in marriage, When these maidens were of marriageable age, he gave them to the nephews of their mother, who were also the grandsons of Tarquinius, joining the elder daughter to the elder nephew, and the younger to the younger, since he thought they would thus live most harmoniously with their husbands. But it happened that each of his sons-in-law was joined by an adverse fate in the matter of dissimilarity of character. For the wife of Lucius, the elder of the two brothers, who was of a bold, arrogant, and tyrannical nature, was a good woman, modest and fond of her father. On the other hand, the wife of Aaron's, the younger brother, a man of great mildness and prudence, was a wicked woman, who hated her father, and was capable of any rash action. Thus it chanced that each of the husbands tried to follow his own bent, but was drawn in the opposite direction by his wife. For when the wicked husband desired to drive his father-in-law from the throne, and was devising every means to accomplish this, his wife by her prayers and tears endeavoured to prevail on him to desist. And when the good husband thought himself obliged to abstain from all attempts against the life of his father-in-law, and wait until he should end his days by the course of nature, and tried to prevent his brother from doing what was wrong, his wicked wife, by her remonstrances and reproaches, and by reviling him with a want of spirit, sought to draw him in the opposite direction. But when nothing was accomplished by either the entreaties of the virtuous wife as she urged upon her unjust husband the best course, or by the exhortations of the wicked wife when she strove to incite to impious deeds the husband who was not by nature evil, but each husband followed his natural bent and thought his wife troublesome because her wishes differed from his own, nothing remained but for the first wife to lament and submit to her fate, and for her audacious sister to rage and endeavour to rid herself of her husband. At last this wicked woman, grown desperate, and believing her sister's husband to be more suitable to her own character, sent for him, as if she wanted to talk with him concerning a matter of urgent importance. And when he came, after first ordering those who were in the room to withdraw, that she might talk with him in private, she said, "May I, Tarquinius, speak freely and without risk all my thoughts concerning our common interests? And will you keep to yourself what you shall hear? Or is it better for me to remain silent and not to communicate plans that require secrecy?" And when Tarquinius bade her to say what she wished, and gave her assurances by such oaths as she herself proposed, that he would keep everything to himself, Tullia, laying aside shame for the moment, said to him, "How long, Tarquinius, do you intend to permit yourself to be deprived of the kingship? Are you descended from mean and obscure ancestors, that you refuse to entertain high thoughts for yourself? But everyone knows that your early ancestors, who were Greeks and descended from Hercules, exercised the sovereign power in the flourishing city of Corinth for many generations, as I am informed, and that your grandfather Tarquinius, after removing from Tyrrhenia, was able by his merits to become the king of this state. And not only his possessions, but his kingdom as well, ought to be descended to you, who are the elder of his grandsons. Or have you been given a body incapable of performing the duties of a king, because of some weakness and deformity? But surely you are endowed both with strength equal to those most highly favoured by nature, and with a presence worthy of your royal birth. Or is it neither of these, but your youth, as yet weak and far from being capable of forming sound judgment, that holds you back and causes you to decline the government of the state? You who want not many years from being 50, yet at about this age a man's judgment is naturally at its best. Well then, is it the high birth of the man who is now in control of affairs and his popularity with the best citizens which makes him difficult to attack, that forces you to submit? But in both these respects he too happens to be unfortunate, as not even he himself is unaware. Moreover, boldness and willingness to undergo danger are inherent in your character, qualities most necessary to one who is going to reign. You have sufficient wealth also, numerous friends, and many other important qualifications for public life. Why then do you still hesitate, and wait for an occasion to be provided by chance? an occasion that will come bringing to you the kingship without your having made any effort to obtain it, and that I presume will be after the death of Tullius, as if fate waited on men's delays, or nature dispensed death to each man according to his age, and the outcome of all human affairs were not, on the contrary, obscure and difficult to be foreseen. But I will declare frankly, even though you may call me bold of it, what seems to me to be the reason why you reach out for no coveted honour or glory. You have a wife whose disposition is in no respect like your own, and who, by her allurements and enchantments, has softened you, and by her you will insensibly be transformed from a man into a nonentity. Just so have I a husband who is timorous and has nothing of a man in him, who makes me humble though I am worthy of great things, and though I am fair of body, yet because of him I have withered away. But if it had been possible for you to take me as your wife, and for me to get you as my husband, we had not lived so long in a private station. Why, therefore, do we not ourselves correct the error of fate by exchanging our marital ties, you removing your wife from life, and I making this disposition of my husband? And when we have put them out of the way, and are joined together, we will then consider in secure what remains to be done, having rid ourselves of what now causes our distress. For though one may hesitate to commit all the other crimes, yet for the sake of a throne one cannot be blamed for daring something. Such were Tullia's words, and Tarquinius, gladly agreeing to the course she proposed, immediately exchanged pledges with her, and then, after celebrating the rites preliminary to their unholy nuptials, he departed. Not long after this the elder daughter of Tullius and the nicer Tarquinius died the same kind of death. Here again I find myself obliged to make mention of Fabius, and to show him guilty of negligence in his investigation of the chronology of events. For when he comes to the death of Aruns, he commits not only one error, as I said before, in stating that he was the son of Tarquinius, but also another, in saying that after his death he was buried by his mother Tanaquil, who could not possibly have been alive at that time. For it was shown in the beginning that when Tarquinius died, Tanaquil was 75 years of age, and if to the 75 years 40 more were added, for we find in the annals that Aruns died in the 40th year of the reign of Tullius, Tanaquil must have been 115 years old. So little evidence of a laborious inquiry after the truth do we find in that author's history. After this deed of theirs, Tarquinius married Tullia without any further delay, though the marriage had neither the sanction of her father nor the approval of her mother, but he took her of his own gift. As soon as these impious and bloodthirsty natures were commingled, they began plotting to drive Tullius from the throne if he would not willingly resign the power. They got together bands of their adherents, appealed to such of the patricians as were ill-disposed towards the king and his popular institutions, and bribed the poorest among the plebeians who had no regard for justice, and all this they did without any secrecy. Tullius, seeing what was afoot, was not only disturbed because of his fears for his own safety, if he should be caught unprepared and come to some harm, but was especially grieved at the thought that he should be forced to take up arms against his own daughter and his son-in-law, and to punish them as enemies. Accordingly he repeatedly invited Tarquinius and his friends to confer with him, and sought with reproaches, and then with admonitions, and then by arguments, to prevent him from doing him any wrong. When Tarquinius gave no heed to what he said, but declared that he would plead his case before the Senate, Tullius called the senators together and said to them, "Senators, it has become clear to me that Tarquinius is gathering a band of conspirators against me, and is anxious to drive me from power. I desire to learn from him, therefore, in the presence of you all, what wrong he has personally received from me, or what injury he has seen the Commonwealth suffer at my hands, that he should be forming these plots against me. Answer me then, Tarquinius, concealing nothing, and say what you have to accuse me of, since you have asked that these men should hear you. Tarquinius answered him, My arriving, Tullius, is brief and founded on justice, and for that reason I have chosen to lay it before these men. Tarquinius, my grandfather, obtained the sovereignty of the Romans after fighting many hard battles in its defence. He being dead, I am his successor according to the laws common by all men, both Greek and barbarians, and it is my right, just as it is of any others who succeed to the estates of their grandfathers, to inherit not only his property, but his kingship as well. You have, it is true, delivered up to me the property that he left, but you are depriving me of the kingship, and have retained possession of it for so long a time now, though you obtained it wrongfully. For neither did any interrex appoint you king, nor did the Senate pass a vote in your favour, nor did you obtain this power by a legal election of the people, as my grandfather and all the kings before him obtained it, but by bribing and corrupting in every way possible the crowd of vagabonds and paupers, who had been disenfranchised for convictions or for debts, and had no concern for the public interest, and by not admitting even then that you were seeking the power for yourself, but by pretending that you were going to guard it for us who were orphans and infants, and came into control of affairs, and kept promising in the hearing of all that when we came to manhood you would hand over the sovereignty to me as the elder brother. You ought therefore, if you desired to do right, when you handed over to me the estate of my grandfather, to have delivered up his kingship also together with his property, following the example of all the upright guardians who, having taken upon themselves the care of royal children bereft of their parents, have rightly and justly restored to them the kingdoms of their fathers and ancestors when they came to be men. But if you thought I had not yet attained a proper degree of prudence, and that by reason of my youth I was still unequal to the government of so great a state, yet when I attained to my full vigour of body and mind at the age of 30, you ought at that time, the same time that you gave me your daughter in marriage, to have also put the affairs of the state into my hands. For it was at that very age that you yourself first undertook both the guardianship of our family and the oversight of the kingship. If you had done this, you would in the first place have gained the reputation of a loyal and just man, and again, you would have reigned with me and shared in every honour, and you would have been called my benefactor, my father, and my preserver, and all the other laudatory names that men bestow in recognition of noble actions, instead of depriving me of all these 44 years of what was mine, though I was neither maimed in body nor stupid in mind. And after that, have you the assurance to ask me what ill treatment provokes me to look upon you as my enemy, and for what reason I accuse you? Nay, do you answer me rather, Tullius, and declare why you think me unworthy to inherit the honours of my grandfather, and what specious reason you allege for depriving me of them. Is it because you do not regard me as the legitimate offspring of my blood, but as some supposititious and illegitimate child? If so, why did you act as guardian to one who was a stranger to his blood, and why did you deliver up the estate to me as soon as I reached manhood? Or is it that you still look upon me as an orphan child and incapable of handling the business of the state, me who am not far from 50 years old? Lay aside now the dissimulation of your shameless questions, and cease at last to play the rogue. However, if you have any just reason to allege against what I have said, I am ready to leave the decision to these men as judges, that whom you can name none better in the city. But if you attempt to run away from this tribunal and fly for refuge, as is ever your habit, to the rabble you mislead by your cajolery, I will not permit it. For I am prepared not only to speak in my defence of my rights, but also, if this should fail to convince you, to act with force." When he had done speaking, Tullius took the floor and said, "Anything, it seems, senators, that is unexpected is to be expected by a mortal man, and nothing should be regarded as incredible, since Tarquinius here is set upon disposing me from my office, though I received him when he was an infant, and when his enemies were forming designs against his life, preserved him and brought him up, and when he came to be a man, saw fit to take him for a son-in-law, and in the event of my death was intending to leave him as heir to all that I possessed. But now that everything has happened to me contrary to my expectations, and I myself am accused of wrongdoing, I shall lament my misfortune later on, but at present I will plead my just cause against him. I took upon myself, Tarquinius, the guardianship of your brother and yourself when you were left infants, not of my own free will, but compelled by the circumstances, since those who aspired to the kingship had openly assassinated your grandfather, and were said to be plotting secretly against you and the rest of his kin, and all your friends acknowledged that if those men once got the power into their hands, they would not leave even a seed of the race of the Tarquins. And there was no one else to care for you and guard you but a woman, the mother of your father, and she, by reason of her great age, herself stood in need of others to take care of her. But you children were left in my charge alone, to be guarded in your destitute condition, though you now call me a stranger and in no degree related to you. Nevertheless, when I had been put in command of such a situation, I not only punished the assassins of your grandfather and reared you boys to manhood, but, as I had no male issue, I proposed to make you the owners of what I possessed. You have now, Tarquinius, the account of my guardianship, and you will not venture to say that a word of it is false. But concerning the kingship, since this is the point of your accusation, learn not only by what means I obtained it, but also for what reason I am not resigning it either to you nor to anyone else. When I took upon myself the oversight of the Commonwealth, finding that there were certain plots forming against me, I desired to surrender the conduct of affairs to the people, and having called them all together in assembly, I offered to resign the power to them, exchanging this envied sovereignty, the source of more pains than pleasures, for a quiet life free from danger. But the Romans would not permit me to follow this preference, nor did they see fit to make anyone else master of the state, but retained me, and by their votes gave me the kingship, a thing which belonged to them, Tarquinius, rather than to you or your brother, in the same manner as they had entrusted the government to your grandfather, who was a foreigner, and in no way related to the king who preceded him. And yet King Ancius Marcius had left sons in their prime of life, not children and infants, as you and your brother were left by Tarquinius. But if it were a general law that the heirs to the estate and possessions of deceased kings should also be heirs to their kingly office, Tarquinius, your grandfather would not have succeeded to the sovereignty upon the death of Ancius, but rather the elder of the king's sons. But the Roman people did not call to power the heir of the father, but rather the person who was worthy to rule. For they held that, while property belongs to those who acquire it, the kingly office belongs to those who confer it, and that the former, when anything happens to its owners, ought to be able to descend to the natural heirs or the testamentary heirs, but that the latter, when the person who receives it dies, should return to those who gave it, unless indeed you have some claim to offer to the effect that your grandfather received the kingship upon certain express conditions, whereby he was not to be deprived of it himself and could also leave it to you, his grandsons, and that it was not in the power of the people to take it from you and confer it upon me. If you have any such claims to allege, why do you not produce the contract? But you cannot do so. And if I did not obtain the office in the most justifiable manner, as you say, since I was neither chosen by the interrex nor entrusted with the government by the Senate, or the other legal requirements were not observed, then surely it is these men here that I am wronging and not you, and I deserve to be deprived of power by them, not by you. But I am not wronging either these men nor anyone else. The length of my reign, which has now lasted 40 years, bears me witness that power was both then justly given to me and is now justly vested in me. For during this time none of the Romans ever thought I reigned unjustly, nor did either the people or the Senate ever endeavour to drive me from power, but to pass over all these matters and to come to grips with your challenges. If I had been depriving you of a deposit that had been left in my hands to your grandfather, in trust for you, and contrary to all the established rules of justice recognised by mankind, had been retaining the kingship which was yours, you ought to have gone to those who granted the power to me, and to have vented your indignation and reproaches, both against me for continuing to hold what did not belong to me, and against them for having conferred on me what belonged to others. For you would easily have convinced them if you had been able to urge any just claim. If, however, you had no confidence in this argument, and yet thought that I had no right to rule the state, and that you were a more suitable person to be entrusted with its oversight, you ought to have done as follows: to have made an investigation of my mistakes and enumerated your own services, and then to have challenged me to a trial for the determination of our respective merits. Neither of these things did you do, but after all this time, as if recovered from a long fit of drunkenness, you now come to accuse me, and even now not where you should have come. For it is not here that you should present these charges. Do not take any offence at this statement of mine, senators, for it is not with a view of taking the decision away from you that I say this, but from the desire to expose this man's calumnies. But you ought to have told me beforehand to call an assembly of the people, and there to have accused me. However, since you have avoided doing so, I will do it for you, and having called the people together, I will appoint them judges of any crimes of which you may accuse me, and will again leave it to them to decide which of the two of us is the most suitable to hold the sovereignty. And whatever they shall unanimously decide I ought to do, that I will do. As for you, this is a sufficient answer, since it is the same whether one urges many or few just claims against unreasonable adversaries, for mere words naturally cannot bring any argument which will persuade them to be honest. But I have been surprised, senators, that any of you wish to remove me from power and have conspired with this man against me. I should like to learn from them what injury provokes them to attack me, and at what action of mine they are offended. Is it because they know that great numbers during my reign have been put to death without a trial, banished from their country, deprived of their possessions, or have met with any other misfortune, which they have not merited? Or, though they can accuse most of none of these tyrannical misdeeds, are they acquainted with any outrages I have been guilty of towards married women, or insults to their maiden daughters, or any other wanton attempt upon a person of a free condition? If I have been guilty of any such crime, I should deserve to be deprived at the same time of both the kingship and of my life. Well then, am I haughty? Am I burdensome by my severity? And can no one bear the arrogance of my administration? And yet, which of my predecessors constantly used his power with such moderation and kindliness, treating all the citizens as an indulgent father treats his own children? What, I did not even desire to retain all the power which you, following the traditions of your fathers, gave to me, but after establishing laws, which you all confirmed, relating to the most essential matters, I then granted to you the privilege of giving and receiving justice in accordance with these laws, and to these rules of justice which I prescribed for others I showed myself the first to yield obedience, like any private citizen. Nor did I make myself the judge of all sorts of crimes, but causes of a private nature I restored to your jurisdiction, a thing which none of the former kings ever did. But it appears that it is no wrongdoing on my part that has drawn upon me the ill will of certain persons, but it is rather the benefits I have confirmed on the plebeians that grieve you unjustly, concerning which I have often given you my reasons. But there is no need for such explanations now. If you believe that Tarquinius here, by taking over the government, will administer affairs better than I shall not envy the commonwealth of a better ruler, and after I have surrendered the sovereignty to the people from whom I received it, and have become a private citizen, I shall endeavour to make it plain to all that I not only know how to rule well, but can also obey with equanimity. After this speech, which covered the conspirators with shame, Tullius dismissed the meeting, and then, summoning the heralds, he ordered them to go through the streets and call the people together to a public assembly. And when the whole populace of the city had flocked to the forum, he came forward to the tribunal and made a long and moving harangue, enumerating all the military achievements he had performed both during the lifetime of Tarquinius and after his death, and recounting in addition, one by one, all his administrative measures, from which the Commonwealth appeared to have reaped many great advantages. And when everything he said met with great applause, and all the people earnestly desired to know for what reasons he mentioned these things, at last he said that Tarquinius accused him of retaining the kingship unjustly, since it belonged to himself. For Tarquinius claimed that his grandfather at his death had left him the sovereignty together with his property, and that the people did not have it in their power to bestow it on another, as it was not their own to give. This raising a general clamour and indignation among the people, he ordered them to be silent and asked them to feel no displeasure or resentment at his words, but in case Tarquinius had any just claim to advance in support of his pretensions, to summon him, and if, after learning what he had to say, they should find that he was being wronged and was the more suitable man to rule, to entrust him with the leadership of the Commonwealth. As for himself, he said, he now resigned the sovereignty and restored it to those to whom it belonged and from whom he had received it. After he had said this and was on the point of descending from the tribunal, there was a general outcry, and many begged of him with groans not to surrender the sovereignty to anyone, and some of them even called out to stone Tarquinius. He, however, fearing summary punishment, since the crowds were already making a rush against him, fled, and his companions with him, while the entire populace with joy, applause, and many acclamations conducted Tullius as far as his house, and saw him safely established there. When Tarquinius failed in this attempt also, he was dismayed that from the Senate, upon which he had chiefly relied, no assistance had come to him, and remaining at home for some time, he conversed only with his friends. Afterwards, when his wife advised him no longer to play the weakling or hesitate, but to have done with words and proceed to deeds, after he should first have obtained a reconciliation with Tullius by the intercession of friends, to the end that the king, trusting him as having become his friend again, might be the less upon his guard against him. Believing that her advice was most excellent, he began to pretend to repent of his past behaviour, and through friends besought Tullius with many entreaties to forgive him. And he was very easily persuaded, as the man was not only by his nature inclined to reconciliation, but was also averse to waging an implacable contest with his daughter and his son-in-law. Then, as soon as he saw a favourable opportunity, when the people were dispersed about the country for the gathering of the harvest, he appeared in public with his friends, all having swords under their garments, and giving the axes to some of his servants. He himself assumed the royal apparel, and all the other insignia of royalty. Then going to the forum, he took his stand before the Senate house, and ordered the herald to summon the senators thither. Indeed, many of the patricians who were privy to his designs and were urging him on were by pre-arrangement ready in the forum, and so the senators assembled. In the meantime, someone went and informed Tullius, who was at home, that Tarquinius had appeared in public in royal apparel, and was calling a meeting of the Senate, and he, astonished at the other's rashness, set out from his house with more haste than prudence, attended by but a few. And going into the Senate house, and seeing Tarquinius seated on the throne with all the other insignia of royalty, he exclaimed, "Who, most wicked of men, gave you authority to assume this attire?" To which the other replied, "Your boldness and impudence, Tullius, for though you were not even a free man, but a slave, and the son of a slave mother, whom my grandmother got from among the captives, you nevertheless have dared to proclaim yourself king of the Romans." When Tullius heard this, he was so exasperated at the reproach that, heedless of his own safety, he rushed at him with the intent of forcing him to quit the throne. Tarquinius was pleased to see this, and leaping from his seat, seized and bore off the old man, who cried out and called upon his servants to assist him. When he got outside the Senate house, being a man of great vigour and in the prime of his life, he raised the king aloft, and hurled him down the steps that lead from the Senate house to the Comitium. The old man got up from his fall with great difficulty, and seeing the whole neighbourhood crowded with the followers of Tarquinius, and noting a great dearth of his own friends, he set out for home lamenting, only a few persons supporting and escorting him. As he went he dripped much blood, and his entire body was in a wretched plight from his fall. What happened next, terrible to hear, yet astonishing and incredible to have been done. The deeds of his impious daughter have been handed down to us. She, having been informed that her father had gone to the Senate house, and being in haste to know what would be the outcome of the affair, entered her carriage and rode to the forum, and here, hearing what had passed, and seeing Tarquinius standing upon the steps before the Senate house, she was the first person to salute him as king, which she did in a loud voice, and prayed to the gods that his seizing of the sovereignty might redound to the advantage of the Roman state. And after all the rest who had assisted him in gaining the sovereignty had also saluted him as king, she took him aside and said to him, "The first steps, Tarquinius, you have taken in the manner that was fitting, but it is impossible for you to hold the kingship securely so long as my father survives. For by his harangues he will again stir up the populace against you, if he remains alive, but the least part of this day. And you know how attached the whole body of the plebeians are to him. But come, even before he gets home, send some men and put him out of the way." Having said this, she again entered her carriage and departed. Tarquinius upon this occasion also approved of the advice of his most impious wife, and sent some of his servants against Tullius armed with swords. And they, swiftly covering the interval, overtook Tullius when he was already near his house, and slew him, while his body lay freshly slain, and quivering where it had been flung. His daughter arrived, and the street through which her carriage was obliged to pass being very narrow, the mules became fractious at the sight of the body, and the groom who was leading them, moved by the piteous spectacle, stopped short and looked at his mistress. Upon her asking what possessed him not to lead the team on, he said, "Do you not see your father lying dead, Tullia, and that there is no other way but over his body?" This angered her to such a degree that she snatched up the stool from under her feet and hurled it at the groom, saying, "Will you not lead on, accursed wretch, even over the body?" Thereupon the groom, with lamentations caused more by the shocking deed than by the blow, led the mules forcibly over the body. this street, which before was called Orbian Street, is, from this horrible and detestable incident, called by the Romans in their own language, Impious Street, that is, Vicious Scleratus. Such was the death which fell to the lot of Tullius after he had reigned 44 years. The Romans say that this man was the first who altered ancestral customs and laws by receiving the sovereignty not from the Senate and the people jointly, like all the former kings, but from the people alone, the poorer sort of whom he had won over by bribery and many other ways of courting popular favour. And this is true. For before this time, upon the death of a king, it was customary for the people to grant to the Senate the authority to establish such a form of government as they should think fit, and the Senate created interrexes who appointed the best man king, whether he was a native Roman or a foreigner. And if the Senate approved of the one so chosen and the people by their vote confirmed the choice, and if the auguries also gave their sanction to it, he assumed the sovereignty. But if any one of these formalities was lacking, they named a second and then a third, if it so happened that the second was likewise not found unobjectionable by both the men and the gods. Tullius, on the contrary, at first assumed the guise of a royal guardian, as I said before, after which he gained the affection of the people by certain ingratiating acts, and was appointed king by them alone. But as he proved to be a man of mildness and moderation by his subsequent actions, he put an end to the complaints caused by his not having observed the laws in all respects, and gave occasion for many to believe that, if he had not been made away with so soon, he would have changed the form of government to a democracy. And they say it was for this reason chiefly that some of the patricians joined in the conspiracy against him, that being unable by any other means to overthrow his power, they took Tarquinius as an ally in their undertaking and aided him in gaining the sovereignty, it being their wish not only to weaken the power of the plebeians, which had received no small addition from the political measures of Tullius, but also to recover their own former dignity. The death of Tullius having occasioned a great tumult and lamentation throughout the whole city, Tarquinius was afraid lest, if the body should be carried through the forum according to the customs of the Romans, adorned with the royal robes and the other marks of honour usual in royal funerals, some attack would be made against him by the populace before he had firmly established his authority, and accordingly he would not permit any of the usual ceremonies to be performed in his father-in-law's honour. But the wife of Tullius, who was daughter to Tarquinius, the former king, with a few of her friends, carried the body out of the city at night as if it had been that of some ordinary person, and after uttering many lamentations over the fate of both herself and her husband, and heaping countless insults upon her son-in-law and her daughter, she buried the body in the ground. Then, returning home from the sepulchre, she lived but one day after the burial. During the following night, the manner of her death was not generally known. Some said that in her grief she lost all desire to live and died by her own hand, others that she was murdered by her son-in-law and her daughter, because of her compassion and affection for her husband. For the reasons mentioned then, the body of Tullius could not be given a royal funeral and a stately monument, but his achievements have won lasting remembrance for all time. And it was made clear by another prodigy that the man was dear to the gods, in consequence of which that fabulous and incredible opinion I have already mentioned concerning his birth also came to be regarded by many as true. For in the Temple of Fortune which he himself had built there stood a gilded wooden statue of Tullius, and when a conflagration occurred and everything else was destroyed, the statue alone remained uninjured by the flames, and even to this day, although the temple itself and all the objects in it which were restored to their former condition after the fire are obviously the products of modern art, the statue, as aforetime, is of ancient workmanship, for it still remains an object of veneration by the Romans. Concerning Tullius, these are all the facts that have been handed down to us. He was succeeded in the sovereignty over the Romans by Lucius Tarquinius, who obtained it not in accordance with the laws but by arms in the 4th year of the 61st Olympiad, the one in which Agatharchus of Corcyra won the foot race, Theracles being Archon at Athens. This man, despising not only the populace but the patricians as well, by whom he had been brought to power, confounded and abolished the customs, the laws, and the whole native form of government by which the former kings had observed order in the commonwealth, and transformed his rule into an avowed tyranny. And first he placed above his person a guard of very daring men, both natives and foreigners, armed with swords and spears, who camped around the palace at night and attended him in the daytime, wherever he went, effectually securing for him from the attempts of conspirators. Secondly, he did not appear in public often or at stated times, but only rarely and unexpectedly, and he transacted the public business at home, for the most part, and in the presence of none but his most intimate friends, and only occasionally went into the forum. To none who sought an audience would he grant it unless he himself had sent for them, and even to those who did gain access to him, he was not gracious or mild, but, as is the way with tyrants, harsh and irascible, and his aspect was terrifying rather than genial. His decisions in controversies relating to contracts he rendered not with regard to justice and laws, but according to his moods. For these reasons the Romans gave him the surname of Superbus, which in our language means the haughty, and his grandfather they called Priscus, or as we say the elder, since both his names were the same as those of the younger man. When he thought he was now in secure possession of the sovereignty, he suborned the basest of his friends to bring charges against many of the prominent men and place them on trial for their lives. He began with such as were hostile to him and resented his driving of Tullius from power, and next he accused all of those whom he thought to be aggrieved by the changes and those who had great riches. When the accusers brought these men to trial, charging them with various fictitious crimes, but chiefly with conspiring against the king, it was by Tarquinius himself, sitting as judge, that the charges were heard. Some of the accused he condemned to death and others to banishment, and seizing the property of both the slain and the exiled, he assigned some small part to the accusers, but retained the largest part for himself. The result was therefore bound to be that many influential men, knowing the motives underlying the plots against them, voluntarily, before they could be convicted of any charges brought against them, left the city to the tyrant, and the number of these men was much greater than of the others. There were some who were even seized in their homes or in their country estates, and secretly murdered by him, men of note, and not even their bodies were seen again. After he had destroyed the best part of the Senate by death or by exile for life, he constituted another Senate himself by working his own followers into the honours of the men who had disappeared. Nevertheless, not even these men were permitted by him to do or say anything but what he himself commanded. Consequently, when the senators who were left of those who had been enrolled in the Senate under Tullius, and who had hitherto been at odds with the plebeians, and had expected the change in the form of government to turn out to their advantage, for Tarquinius had held out such promises to them with a view of deluding and tricking them, now found that they had no longer any share in the government, but that they too, as well as the plebeians, had been deprived of their freedom of speech, although they lamented their fate and suspected that things would be still more terrible in the future than they were at the moment, yet having no power to prevent what was going on, they were forced to acquiescence in the existing state of affairs. The plebeians, seeing this, looked upon them as justly punished, and in their simplicity rejoiced at their discomfiture, imagining that the tyranny would be burdensome to the senators alone, and would involve no danger to themselves. Nevertheless, to them also came even more hardship not long afterwards, for the laws drawn up by Tullius, by which they all received justice alike from each other and by which they were secured from being injured by the patricians, as before, in their contracts with them, were all abolished by Tarquinius, who did not leave even the tablets on which the laws were written, but ordered them to be removed from the forum and melted down. After this he abolished the taxes based on the census and revised the original form of taxation, and whenever he required money, the poorest citizens contributed the same amount as the richest. This measure ruined a large part of the plebeians, since every man was obliged to pay 10 drachma as his individual share of the very first tax. He also forbade the holding in future of any kind of the assemblies to which hitherto the inhabitants of the villages, the members of the curia, and the residents of a neighbourhood, both in the city and in the country, had resorted in order to perform religious ceremonies and sacrifices in common, lest large numbers of people meeting together should form secret conspiracies to overthrow his power. He had spies scattered about in many places who secretly inquired into everything that was said and done, while remaining undiscovered by most persons, and by insinuating themselves into the conversation of their neighbours, and sometimes by reviling the tyrant themselves, they sounded every man's sentiments. Afterwards they informed the tyrant of all who were dissatisfied with the existing state of affairs, and the punishments of those who were found guilty were severe and relentless. Nor was he satisfied merely with these illegal vexations of the plebeians, but after selecting from among them such as were loyal to himself and fit for war, he compelled the rest to labour on the public works in the city, for he believed that monarchs are exposed to the greatest danger when the worst and the most needy of the citizens live in idleness, and at the same time he was eager to complete during his own reign the works his grandfather had left half finished, namely, to extend to the river the drainage canals which the other had begun to dig, and also to surround the circus, which had been carried up no higher than the foundations, with covered porticos. At these undertakings all the poor laboured, receiving from him but a moderate allowance of grain. Some of them were employed in quarrying stone, others in hewing timber, some in driving the wagons that transported these materials, and others in carrying the burdens themselves upon their shoulders, still others in digging the subterranean drains and constructing the arches over them, and in erecting the porticos and serving the various artisans who were thus employed, and smiths, carpenters, and masons were taken from their private undertakings and kept at work in the service of the public. Thus the people, being worn out by these works, had no rest, so that the patricians, seeing their hardships and servitude, rejoiced in turn, and forgot their own miseries. Yet neither of them attempted to put a stop to these proceedings, Tarquinius considering that those rulers who have not got their power legally, but have obtained it by arms, require a bodyguard, not of natives only, but also of foreigners, earnestly endeavoured to gain the friendship of the most illustrious and the most powerful men of the whole Latin nation, by giving his daughter to this man in marriage. This man was Octavius Mamilius, who traced his lineage back to Telegonus, the son of Ulysses and Circe. He lived in the city of Tusculum, and was looked upon as a man of singular sagacity in political manners, and a competent military commander. When Tarquinius had gained the friendship of this man, and through him had won over the chief men at the head of affairs in each city, he resolved then at last to try his strength in warfare, in the open, and to lead an expedition against the Sabines, who refused to obey his orders, and looked upon themselves as released from the terms of their treaty upon the death of Tullius, with whom they had made it. After he had taken this resolution, he sent messengers to invite to the council at Ferentinum those who were accustomed to meet together there on behalf of the Latin nation, and appointed a day, intimating that he wished to consult with them concerning some important matter of mutual interest. The Latins accordingly appeared, but Tarquinius, who had summoned them, did not come at the time appointed. They waited for a long time, and the majority of them regarded his behaviour as an insult. Among them was a certain man named Turnus Herodias, who lived in the city of Corilla, and was powerful by reason of both his riches and his friends, valiant in war and not without ability in political debate. He was not only at variance with Mamilius, owing to their rivalry for power in the state, but also on account of Mamilius, an enemy to Tarquinius, because the king had seen fit to take the other for his son-in-law in preference to himself. This man now inveighed at length against Tarquinius, enumerating all the other actions of the man which seemed to show evidence of arrogance and presumption, and laying particular stress upon his not appearing at the assembly which he himself had summoned, when all the rest were present. But Mamilius attempted to excuse Tarquinius, attributing his delay to some unavoidable cause, and asked that the assembly might be adjourned to the next day, and the presiding officers of the Latins were prevailed on to do so. The next day Tarquinius appeared, and, the assembly having been called together, he first excused his delay in a few words, and at once entered upon a discussion of the supremacy, which he insisted belonged to him by right, since Tarquinius his grandfather had held it, having acquired it by war, and he offered in evidence the treaties made by the various cities with Tarquinius. After saying a great deal in favour of his claim and concerning the treaties, and promising to confer great advantages on the cities in case they should continue in their friendship, he at last endeavoured to persuade them to join him in an expedition against the Sabines. When he had ceased speaking, Turnus, the man who had censured him for his failure to appear in time, came forward and sought to dissuade the council from yielding to him the supremacy, both on the ground that it did not belong to him by right, and also because it would not be in the interest of the Latins to yield it to him, and he dwelt long upon both of these points. He said that the treaties they had made with the grandfather of Tarquinius, when they granted to him the supremacy, had been terminated after his death, no clause having been added to those treaties providing that the same grant should be descended to his posterity, and he showed that the man who claimed the right to inherit the grants made to his grandfather was of all men the most lawless and most wicked, and he recounted the things he had done in order to possess himself of the sovereignty over the Romans. After enumerating many terrible charges against him, he ended by informing them that Tarquinius did not even hold the kingship over the Romans in accordance with the laws by taking it with their consent, like the former kings, but had prevailed by arms and violence, and that having established a tyranny, he was putting some of the citizens to death, banishing others, despoiling others of their estates, and taking from all of them their liberty both of speech and action. He declared it would be an act of great folly and madness to hope for anything good and beneficent from a wicked and impious nature, and to imagine that a man who had not spared such as were his nearest to him both in blood and friendship would spare those who were strangers to him. And he advised them, as long as they had not yet accepted the yoke of slavery, to fight to the end against accepting it, judging from the misfortunes of others what it would be their own fate to suffer. After Turnus had thus inveighed against Tarquinius, and most of those present had been greatly moved by his words, Tarquinius asked that the following day might be set for his defence. His request was granted, and when the assembly had been dismissed, he summoned his most intimate friends and consulted with them how he ought to handle the situation. These began to suggest to him the arguments he should use in his defence, and to run over the means by which he should endeavour to win back the favour of the majority. But Tarquinius himself declared that the situation did not call for any such measures, and gave it as his own opinion that he ought not to attempt to refute the accusations, but rather to kill the accuser himself. When all had praised this opinion, he arranged with them the details of the attack, and then set about carrying out a plot that was least likely to be foreseen by any man and guarded against. seeking out the most evil among the servants of Turnus, who conducted his pack animals with the baggage, and bribing them with money, he persuaded them to take from him a large number of swords at nightfall, and put them away in the baggage chest where they would not be in sight. The next day, when the assembly had convened, Tarquinius came forward and said that his defence against the accusations was a brief one, and he proposed that all accusers should be the judges of all the charges. For counsellors, he said, Turnus here, as a judge himself, acquitted me of everything of which he now accuses me, when he desired my daughter in marriage. But since he was thought unworthy of the marriage, as was but natural, for who in his senses would have refused Mamilius, the man of the higher birth and greater merit among the Latins, and consented to take for his son-in-law the man who cannot trace his family back even 5 generations. In resentment for this slight, he has now come to accuse me, whereas, if he knew me to be such a man as he now charges, he ought not to have desired me then as a father-in-law, and if he thought me a good man when he asked me for my daughter in marriage, he ought not now to call me a wicked man. So much concerning myself. As for you, counsellors, who are running the greatest of dangers, it is not for you to consider now whether I am a good or a bad man, for this you may inquire into afterwards, but to provide both for your own safety and for the liberty of your respective cities. For a plot is being formed by this fine demagogue against you, who are the chief men of your cities, and are the heads of affairs, and he is prepared, after he has put the most prominent of you to death, to attempt to seize the sovereignty over the Latins, and has come here for that purpose. I do not say this from conjecture, but from my certain knowledge, having last night received information of it from one of the accomplices in the conspiracy, and I will give you an incontestable proof of what I say, if you will go to his lodging, by showing you the arms that are concealed there. After he had thus spoken, they all cried out, and fearing for the men's safety, demanded that he prove the matter and not impose upon them. And Turnus, since he was unaware of the treachery, cheerfully offered to submit to the investigation, and invited the presiding officers to search his lodgings, saying that one of 2 things ought to come of it, either that he himself should be put to death if he were found to have provided more arms than were necessary for his journey, or that the person who had accused him falsely should be punished. This offer was accepted, and those who went to his lodgings found the swords which had been hidden in the baggage chests by the servant. After this, they would not permit Turnus to say anything more in his defence, but cast him into a pit, and promptly dispatched him by burying him alive. As for Tarquinius, they praised him in the assembly as the common benefactor of all their cities, for having saved the lives of all their chief citizens, and they appointed him leader of their nation upon the same terms as they had appointed Tarquinius, his grandfather, and after him Tullius, and having engraved the treaty on pillars and confirmed it by oaths, they dismissed the assembly. After Tarquinius had obtained the supremacy over the Latins, he sent ambassadors to the cities of the Hyrcanians and those of the Volscians to invite them also to enter into a treaty of friendship and alliance with him. The Hyrcanians unanimously voted in favour of the alliance, but of the Volscians only 2 cities, Achetra and Antium, accepted the invitation, and as a means of providing that the treaties made with these cities might endure forever, Tarquinius resolved to designate a temple for the joint use of the Romans, the Latins, the Hyrcanians, and such of the Volscians as had entered into the alliance, in order that, coming together each year at the appointed place, they might celebrate a general festival, feast together, and share in common sacrifices. This proposal being cheerfully accepted by all of them, he appointed for their place of assembly a high mountain situated almost at the centre of these nations, and commanding the city of the Albans. And he made a law that upon this mountain an annual festival should be celebrated, during which they should all abstain from acts of hostility against any of the others, and should perform common sacrifices to Jupiter Lateralis, as he is called, and feast together. And he appointed the share each city was to contribute towards these sacrifices, and the portion each of them was to receive. The cities that shared in this festival and sacrifice were 47. These festivals and sacrifices the Romans celebrate to this day, calling them the Latin festivals, and some of the cities that take part in them bring lambs, some cheese, others a certain mixture of milk, and others something of like nature, and one bull is sacrificed in common by all of them, each city receiving its appointed share of the meat. The sacrifices they offer are on behalf of all, and the Romans have the superintendence of them. When he had strengthened his power by these alliances also, he resolved to lead his army against the Sabines, choosing such of the Romans as he least suspected of being apt to assert their liberty, if they became possessed of arms, and adding to them the auxiliary forces that had come from his allies, which were much more numerous than those of the Romans. And having laid waste to the enemy's country and defeated in battle those who came in close quarters with him, he led his forces against the people called the Permetini, who lived in the city of Suessa, and had the reputation of both more prosperous than any of their neighbours, and, because of their great good fortune, of being troublesome and oppressive to them all. He accused them of certain acts of brigandage and robbery, and of giving haughty answers when asked for satisfaction thereof. But they were expecting war, and were ready and in arms. Tarquinius engaged them in battle upon the frontiers, and after killing many of them and putting the rest to flight, he shut them up within their walls. And when they no longer ventured out of the city, he encamped nearby, and surrounding it with a ditch and palisades, made continuous assaults upon the walls. The inhabitants defended themselves and withstood the hardships of the siege for a considerable time. But when their provisions began to fail and their strength was spent, since they neither received any assistance nor even obtained any respite, but the same men had to toil both day and night, they were taken by storm. Tarquinius, being now master of the city, put to death all he found in arms, and permitted the soldiers to carry off the women and children and such others as allowed themselves to be made prisoner, together with a multitude of slaves not easy to be numbered. And he also gave them leave to carry away all the plunder of the city that they found both inside the walls and in the countryside. As to the silver and gold that was found there, he ordered it all to be brought to one place, and having reserved 1/10 part of it to build a temple, he distributed the rest among his soldiers. The quantity of silver and gold taken upon this occasion was so considerable that every one of the soldiers received for his share 5 minae of silver, and the 10th part reserved for the gods amounted to no less than 400 talents. When he was still tarrying at Suessa, a messenger brought the news that the flower of the Sabine youth had set out and made an irruption into the territory of the Romans in 2 large armies, and were laying waste to the country, one of them being encamped near Aretum and the other near Fidenae, and that unless a strong force should oppose them, everything there would be lost. When Tarquinius heard this, he left a small part of his army at Suessa, ordering them to guard the spoils and the baggage, and leading the rest of his forces in light marching order against the body of the Sabines, which was encamped near Aretum, he pitched camp upon an eminence within a short distance of the enemy, and the generals of the Sabines having resolved to send for the army that was at Fidenae and to give battle at daybreak, Tarquinius learned of their intention, for the bearer of the letter from these generals to the others had been captured, and availed himself of this fortunate incident by employing the following stratagem. He divided his army into 2 bodies, and sent one of them in the night without the enemy's knowledge to occupy the road that led from Fidenae, and drawing up the other division as soon as it was fully day, he marched out of his camp as if to give battle. The Sabines, seeing the small number of the enemy and believing that their other army from Fidenae would come up at any moment, boldly marched out against them. These armies therefore engaged, and the battle was for a long time doubtful. Then the troops which had been sent out in advance by Tarquinius during the night turned back in their march and prepared to attack the Sabines in the rear. The Sabines, upon seeing them and recognizing them by their arms and their standards, were upset in their calculations, and, throwing away their arms, sought to save themselves by flight. But escape was impossible, for most of them, surrounded as they were by enemies, and the Roman horse pressing upon them from all sides hemmed them in, so that only a few were prompt enough to escape disaster, but the greater part were either cut down by the enemy or surrendered. Nor was there any resistance made even by those who were left in the camp, but this was taken at the first onset, and there, beside the Sabines' own efforts, all the possessions that had been stolen from the Romans, together with many captives, were recovered still uninjured, and were restored to those who had lost them. After Tarquinius had succeeded in his first attempt, he marched with his forces against the rest of the Sabines, who were encamped near Fidenae, and were not yet aware of the destruction of their companions. It happened that these also had set out from their camp and were already on the march, when, coming near to the Roman army, they saw the heads of their commanders fixed upon pikes. For the Romans held them forward in order to strike the enemy with terror, and learning thus that their other army had been destroyed, they no longer performed any deed of bravery, but turning to supplications and entreaties, they surrendered. The Sabines, having had both their armies snatched away in so shameful and disgraceful a manner, were reduced to slender hopes, and fearing that their cities would be taken by assault, they sent ambassadors to treat for peace, offering to surrender, become the subjects of Tarquinius, and pay tribute for the future. He accordingly made peace with them and received the submission of their cities upon the same terms, and then returned to Suessa. Thence he marched with the forces he had left there, the spoils he had taken, and the rest of his baggage to Rome, bringing back his army loaded with riches. After that he also made many incursions into the country of the Volscians, sometimes with his whole army and sometimes with part of it, and captured much booty. But when now most of his undertakings were succeeding according to his wishes, a war broke out on the part of his neighbours, which proved not only of long duration, for it lasted 7 years without intermission, but also important because of the severe and unexpected misfortunes with which it was attended. I will relate briefly from what causes it sprang and how it ended, since it was brought to a conclusion by a clever ruse and a novel stratagem. There was a city of the Latins which had been founded by the Albans, distant 100 stades from Rome, and standing upon the road that leads to Praeneste. The name of this city was Gabii. Today, not all parts of it are still inhabited, but only those that lie next to the highway and are given up to inns. But at the time, it was as large and populous as any city. One may judge both of its extent and importance by observing the ruins of the buildings in many places and the circuit of the wall, most parts of which are still standing. To this city had flocked some of the Parmetini who had escaped from Suessa when Tarquinius took their town, and many of the banished Romans. These, by begging and imploring the Gabini to avenge the injuries they had received, and by promising great rewards if they should be restored to their own possessions, and also by showing the overthrow of the tyrant to be not only possible but easy, since the people of Rome too would aid them, prevailed upon them with the encouragement of the Volscians, for these also had sent ambassadors to them and desired their alliance, to make war upon Tarquinius. After this, both the Gabini and the Romans made incursions into and laid waste one another's territories with large armies, and, as was to be expected, engaged in battles, now with small numbers on each side, and now with all their forces. In these actions the Gabini often put the Romans to flight, and, pursuing them up to their walls, slew many and ravaged the countryside with great impunity. And often the Romans drove the Gabini back, and, shutting them up within their city, carried off their slaves together with much booty. As these things happened continually, both of them were obliged to fortify the strongholds in their territories and to garrison them so that they might serve as places of refuge for the husbandmen. And sallying out from these strongholds in a body, they would fall upon and destroy bands of robbers and any small groups that might be discovered that had been detached from a large army, and, as would naturally be expected in foragers, were observing no order, through contempt of the enemy. And they both were obliged, in their fear of the sudden assaults of the other, to raise the walls and dig ditches around those parts of their cities that were vulnerable and could easily be taken by means of scaling ladders. Tarquinius was particularly active in taking these precautions and employed a large number of workmen in strengthening those parts of the city walls that looked towards Gabii by widening the ditch, raising the walls, and placing the towers at shorter intervals, for on this side of the city it seemed to be the weakest, the rest of the circuit being tolerably secure and difficult of approach. But, as is apt to happen to all cities in the course of long wars, when the country is laid waste by the continual incursion of the enemy and no longer produces its fruit, both were bound to experience a dearth of all provisions and to feel terrible discouragement regarding the future. But the want of necessities was felt more keenly by the Romans than by the Gabini, and the poorest among them, who suffered most, thought a treaty ought to be made with the enemy, and an end put to the war through any terms they might grant. While Tarquinius was dismayed at the situation, and neither willing to end the war upon dishonourable terms, nor able to head out any longer, but was contriving all sorts of schemes and devising ruses of every kind, the eldest of his sons, Sextus by name, privately communicated to him his own plan. And when Tarquinius, who thought the enterprise bold and full of danger, yet not impossible after all, had given him leave to act as he saw fit, he pretended to be at odds with his father about putting an end to the war. Then, after being scourged with rods in the forum by his father's order and receiving other indignities, so that the affair became noised abroad, he first sent some of his most intimate friends as deserters to inform the Gabini secretly that he had resolved to betake himself to them and make war against his father, provided he should receive pledges that they would protect him as well as the rest of the Roman fugitives and not deliver him up to his father in the hope of settling their private enmities to their own advantage. When the Gabini listened to this proposal gladly and agreed not to do him any wrong, he went over to them as a deserter, taking with him many of his friends and clients, and also in order to increase their belief in the genuineness of his revolt from his father, carrying along a great deal of silver and gold. And many flocked to him afterwards from Rome, pretending to flee from the tyranny of Tarquinius, so that he now had a strong body of men about him. The Gabini looked upon the large numbers who came over to them as a great accession of strength, and made no doubt of reducing Rome in a short time. Their delusion was further increased by the actions of this rebellious son, who continually made incursions into his father's territory and captured much booty, for his father, knowing beforehand what parts he would visit, took care that there should be plenty of plunder there, and that the places should be unguarded, and he kept sending men to be destroyed by his son, selecting from among the citizens those whom he held in suspicion. In consequence of all this, the Gabini, believing the man to be their loyal friend and an excellent general, and many of them had also been bribed by him, promoted him to be their supreme commander. After Sextus had obtained so great power by deception and trickery, he sent one of his servants to his father, without the knowledge of the Gabini, both to inform him of the power he had gained, and to inquire what he should now do. Tarquinius, who did not wish even the servant to learn the instructions that he sent his son, led the messenger into the garden that lay beside the palace. It happened that in this garden there were poppies growing, already full of heads and ready to be gathered, and walking among these he kept striking and knocking off the heads of all the tallest poppies with his staff. Having done this, he sent the messenger away without giving any answer to his repeated inquiries. Herein, it seems to me, he imitated the thought of Thrasybulus the Milesian, for Thrasybulus returned no verbal answer to Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, by the messenger Periander once sent him to inquire how he might most securely establish his power, but, ordering the messenger to follow him into the field of wheat and breaking off the ears that stood above the rest, he threw them upon the ground, thereby imitating what Periander ought to lop off, and destroy the most illustrious of the citizens. When therefore Tarquinius did a like thing on this occasion, Sextus understood his father's meaning and knew that he was ordering him to put to death the most eminent of the Gabini. He accordingly called an assembly of the people, and after saying a great deal about himself, he told them that, having fled to them with his friends upon the assurance that they had given him, he was in danger of being seized by certain persons and delivered up to his father, and that he was ready to resign his power and desired to quit their city before any mischief befell him. And while saying this, he wept and lamented his fate, as those do who are in very truth in terror of their lives. When the people became incensed at this, and were eagerly demanding to know who the men were who were intending to betray them, he named Antistius Petro, who not only had been the author of many excellent measures in times of peace, but had also commanded their armies, and had thus become the most distinguished of all their citizens. And when this man endeavoured to clear himself, and from the consciousness of his innocence offered to submit to any examination whatsoever, Sextus said he wished to send some others to search Petro's house, but that he himself would stay with him in the assembly until the persons sent should return. It seems that he had bribed some of the servants of Petro to take the letters prepared for Petro's destruction and sealed with the seal of Tarquinius, and to hide them in their master's house. And when the men sent to make the search, for Petro made no objection but gave permission for his house to be searched, having discovered the letters in the place where they had been hidden, appeared in the assembly with many sealed letters, among them the one addressed to Antistius. Sextus declared he recognized his father's seal, and breaking open the letter, he gave it to the secretary and ordered him to read it. The purport of the letter was that Antistius should, if possible, deliver up his son to him alive, but if he could not do this, he should cut off his head and send it. In return for this, Tarquinius said that, beside the rewards he had already promised, he would grant Roman citizenship both to him and those who had assisted him in the business, and would admit them all to the number of the patricians, and furthermore bestow on them houses, allotments of land, and many other fine gifts. Thereupon the Gabini became so incensed against Antistius, who was thunderstruck at this unexpected calamity and unable in his grief to utter a word, that they stoned him to death and appointed Sextus to inquire into and punish the crimes of his accomplices. Sextus committed the guarding of the gates to his own followers, lest any of the accused should escape him, and sending to the houses of the most prominent of the Gabini, he put many good men to death. While these things were going on, and all the city was in an uproar, as was natural in consequence of so great a calamity, Tarquinius, having been informed by letter of all that was passing, marched thither with his army, approached the city about the middle of the night, and then, when the gates had been opened by those who were appointed for the purpose, entered with his forces and made himself master of the city without any trouble. When this disaster became known, all the citizens bewailed the fate awaiting them, for they expected slaughter, enslavement, and all the horrors that usually befall those captured by tyrants, and, as the best that could happen to them, had already condemned themselves to slavery, the loss of their property, and like calamities. However, Tarquinius did none of the things that they were expecting and dreading, even though he was harsh of temper and inexorable in punishing his enemies. For he neither put any of the Gabini to death, nor banished any from the city, nor punished any of them with disenfranchisement or the loss of their property, but calling an assembly of the people and changing to the part of a king from that of a tyrant, he told them that he not only restored their own city to them and allowed them to keep the property they possessed, but in addition granted to all of them the rights of Roman citizens. It was not, however, out of goodwill to the Gabini that he adopted this course, but in order to establish more securely his mastery over the Romans, for he believed that the strongest safeguard both of himself and his family would be the loyalty of those who, contrary to their expectations, had been preserved and had recovered all their possessions, and in order that they might no longer have any fear regarding the future or any doubts of the permanence of his concessions, he ordered the terms upon which they were to be friends to be set down in writing, and then ratified the treaty immediately in the assembly, and took an oath over the victims to observe it. There is a memorial of this treaty at Rome in the temple of Jupiter Phidias, whom the Romans call Sancus. It is a wooden shield covered with the hide of an ox that was sacrificed at the time they confirmed the treaty by their oaths, and upon it are inscribed in ancient characters the terms of the treaty. After Tarquinius had thus settled matters and appointed his son Sextus the king of the Gabini, he left his army home. Such was the outcome of the war with the Gabini. After this achievement, Tarquinius gave the people a respite from military expeditions and wars, and being desirous of performing the vows made by his grandfather, devoted himself to the building of the sanctuaries. For the elder Tarquinius, while he was engaged in an action during the last war with the Sabines, had made a vow to build temples to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva if he should gain the victory, and he had finished off the peak on which he proposed to erect the temples to the gods by means of retaining walls and high banks of earth, as I mentioned in the preceding book, but he did not live long enough to complete the building of the temples. Tarquinius, therefore, proposing to erect this structure with the 10th part of the spoils taken at Suessa, set all the artisans to work. It was at this time, they say, that a wonderful prodigy appeared under the ground, for when they were digging the foundations and the excavation had been carried down to a great depth, there was found the head of a man newly slain, with the face like that of a living man, and the blood which flowed from the severed head was warm and fresh. Tarquinius, seeing this prodigy, ordered the workmen to leave off digging, and, assembling the native soothsayers, inquired of them what the prodigy meant, and when they could give no explanation but conceded to the Tyrrhenians the mastery of this science, he inquired of them who was the ablest soothsayer among the Tyrrhenians, and when he had found out, sent the most distinguished of the citizens to him as ambassadors. When these men came to the house of the soothsayer, they met by chance a youth who was just coming out, and informing him that they were ambassadors sent from Rome who wanted to speak with the soothsayer, they asked him to announce them to him. The youth replied, "The man you wish to speak with is my father. He is busy at present, but in a short time you may be admitted to him. And while you are waiting for him, acquaint me with the reason of your coming. For if, through inexperience, you are in danger of committing an error in phrasing your question, when you have been informed by me, you will be able to avoid any mistake, for the correct form of question is not the least important part of the art of divination." The ambassadors, resolved to follow his advice, related the prodigy to him, and when the youth had heard it, after a short pause, he said, "Hear me, Romans. My father will interpret this prodigy to you, and will tell you no untruth, since it is not right for a soothsayer to speak falsely, but in order that you may be guilty of no error or falsehood in what you say, or in the answer you give to his question, for it is of importance to you to know these things beforehand. Be instructed by me. After you have related the prodigy to him, he will tell you that he does not fully understand what you say, and will circumscribe with his staff some piece of ground or other. Then he will say to you, 'This is the Tarpeian hill, and this is part of it that faces east, and this is the part of it that faces west. This is the northern point, and this opposite is the southern point.' These parts he will point out to you with his staff, and then ask you in which of these parts the head was found. What answer, therefore, do I advise you to make? Do not admit that the prodigy was found in any of these places he shall inquire about, when he points them out with his staff, but say that it appeared among you at Rome on the Tarpeian hill. If you stick to these answers and do not allow yourselves to be misled by him, he, well knowing that fate cannot be changed, will interpret to you without concealment what the prodigy means." Having received these instructions, the ambassadors, as soon as the old man was at leisure and a servant came out to fetch them, went in and related the prodigy to the soothsayer. He, craftily endeavouring to mislead them, drew circular lines upon the ground and then other straight lines, and asked them, with reference to each place in turn, whether the head had been found there. But the ambassadors, not at all disturbed in mind, stuck to the one answer suggested to them by the soothsayer's son, always naming Rome and the Tarpeian Hill, and asked the interpreter not to appropriate the omen to himself, but to answer in the most sincere and just manner. The soothsayer, accordingly, finding it impossible for him either to impose upon the men or to appropriate the omen, said to them, "Romans, tell your fellow citizens, it is ordained by fate that the place in which you found the head shall be the head of all Italy. Since that time the place is called the Capitoline Hill from the head that was found there, for the Romans call heads Capita." Tarquinius, having heard these things from the ambassadors, set the artisans to work and built the greater part of the temple, although he was not able to complete the whole work, being driven from power too soon. But the Roman people brought it to completion in the third consulship. It stood upon a high base and was 800 feet in circuit, each side measuring close to 200 feet. Indeed, one would find the excess of the length over the width to be but slight, in fact, not a full 15 feet. For the temple that was built in the time of our fathers after the burning of this one was erected upon the same foundations, and differed from the ancient structure in nothing but the costliness of its materials, having 3 rows of columns on the front facing the south and a single row on each side. The temple consists of 3 parallel shrines separated by party walls. The middle shrine is dedicated to Jupiter, while on one side stands that of Juno and on the other that of Minerva, all 3 being under one pediment and one roof. It is said that during the reign of Tarquinius another very wonderful piece of good luck also came to the Roman state, conferred upon it by the favour of some god or other divinity, and this good fortune was not of short duration, but throughout the whole existence of the country it has often saved it from great calamities. A certain woman who was not a native of the country came to the tyrant wishing to sell him 9 books, filled with Sibylline oracles, but when Tarquinius refused to purchase the books at the price she asked, she went away and burned 3 of them, and not long afterwards, bringing the remaining 6 books back, she offered to sell them at the same price. But when they thought her a fool and mocked her for asking the same price for the smaller number of books that she had been unable to get for even the larger number, she again went away and burned half of those that were left. Then, bringing the remaining books, she asked the same amount of money for these. Tarquinius, wondering at the woman's purpose, sent for the augurs and, acquainting them with the matter, asked them what he should do. These, knowing by certain signs that he had rejected a God-sent blessing, and declaring it to be a great misfortune that he had not purchased all of the books, directed him to pay the woman all the money she had asked, and to get the oracles that were left. The woman, after delivering the books, and bidding him to take great care of them, disappeared from among men. Tarquinius chose 2 men of distinction from among the citizens, and appointing 2 public slaves to assist them, entrusted to them the guardianship of the books. And when one of these men, named Marcus Attilius, seemed to have been faithless to his trust, and was informed upon by one of the public slaves, he ordered him to be sewed up in a leather bag and thrown into the sea as a patricide. Since the expulsion of the kings, the Commonwealth, taking upon itself the guarding of these oracles, entrusts the care of them to persons of the greatest distinction, who hold this office for life, being exempt from military service and from all civil employments, and it assigns public slaves to assist them, in whose absence the others are not permitted to inspect the oracles. In short, there is no possession of the Romans, sacred or profane, which they guard so carefully as they do the Sibylline oracles. They consult them by order of the Senate, when the state is in the grip of party strife, or some great misfortune has happened to them in war, or some important prodigies and apparitions have been seen, which are difficult to interpret, as has often happened. These oracles, until the time of the Marsian War, as it was called, were kept underground in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, in a stone chest, under the guard of 10 men. But when the temple was burned after the close of the 173rd Olympiad, either purposely, as some think, or by accident, these oracles, together with all the offerings consecrated to the god, were destroyed by the fire. Those which are now extant have been scraped together from many places, some from the cities of Italy, others from Erythrae in Asia, whither 3 envoys were sent by vote of the Senate to copy them, and others were brought from other cities, transcribed by private persons. Some of these are found to be interpolations among the genuine Sibylline oracles, being recognized as such by means of the so-called acrostics. In all this I am following the account given by Terentius Varro in his work on religion. Beside these achievements of Tarquinius, both in peace and in war, he founded 2 colonies. One of them, called Signia, was not planned, but was due to chance, the soldiers having established their winter quarters in the place and built their camp in such a manner as not to differ in any respect from a city. But it was with deliberate purpose that he settled Circe, because the place was advantageously situated in relation to the Pomptine Plain, which is the largest of all the plains in the Latin country, and to the sea that is contiguous to it. For it is a fairly high rock in the nature of a peninsula situated on the Tyrrhenian Sea, and tradition has it that Circe, the daughter of the sun, lived there. He assigned both these colonies to 2 of his sons as their founders, giving Circe to Aruns, and Signa to Titus, and being now no longer in any fear concerning his power, he was both driven from power and exiled because of the outrageous deed of Sextus, his eldest son, who ruined a married woman. Of this calamity that was to overtake his house, heaven had forewarned him by numerous omens, and particularly by this final one. 2 eagles, coming in the spring to the garden near the palace, made the eyrie on the top of a tall palm tree. While these eagles had their young as yet unfledged, a flock of vultures, flying to the eyrie, destroyed it and killed the young birds, and when the eagles returned from their feeding, the vultures, tearing them and striking them with the flat of their wings, drove them from the palm tree. Tarquinius, seeing these omens, took all possible precautions to avert his destiny, but proved unable to conquer fate. For when the patricians set themselves against him and the people were of the same mind, he was driven from power. Who the authors of this insurrection were and by what means they came to control affairs, I shall endeavour to relate briefly. Tarquinius was then laying siege to Ardea, alleging as his reason that it was receiving the Roman fugitives and assisting them in their endeavours to return home. The truth was, however, that he had designs against this city on account of its wealth, since it was the most flourishing of all the cities in Italy. But the Ardeates bravely defended themselves, and the siege was proving a lengthy one, both the Romans who were in the camp being fatigued at the length of the war, and those at Rome, who had become exhausted by the war taxes, were ready to revolt if any occasion offered for making a beginning. At this time Sextus, the eldest son of Tarquinius, being sent by his father to a city called Colatia to perform certain military services, lodged at the house of his kinsman Lucius Tarquinius, surnamed Colatinus. This man is said by Fabius to have been the son of Agarius, who, as I have shown earlier, was the nephew of Tarquinius, the first Roman king of that name, and having been appointed governor of Colatia, was not only himself called Colatinus from his living there, but also left the same surname to his posterity. But for my part I am persuaded that he too was a grandson of Agarius, insomuch as he was of the same age as the sons of Tarquinius, as Fabius and the other historians have recorded, for the chronology confirms me in this opinion. Now it happened that Colatinus was then at the camp, but his wife, who was a Roman woman, the daughter of Lucretius, a man of distinction, entertained him, as a kinsman of her husband, with great cordiality and friendliness. This matron, who exceeded all the Roman women in beauty as well as in virtue, Sextus tried to seduce. He had already long entertained this desire, whenever he visited his kinsman, and he thought he now had a favourable opportunity. Going therefore to bed after supper, he waited a great part of the night, and then, when he thought all were asleep, he got up and came to the room where he knew Lucretia slept, and without being discovered by her slaves, who lay asleep at the door, he went into the room sword in hand. When he paused at the woman's bedside, and she, hearing the noise, awakened and asked who it was, he told her his name, and bade her to be silent and remain in the room, threatening to kill her if she attempted either to escape or to cry out. Having terrified the woman in this manner, he offered her two alternatives, bidding her choose whichever she herself preferred, death with dishonour or life with happiness. For, he said, if you will consent to gratify me, I will make you my wife, and with you shall reign, for the present, over the city my father has given me, and after his death over the Romans, the Latins, the Tyrrhenians, and all the other nations he rules. For I know that I shall succeed to my father's kingdom, as is right, since I am his eldest son. But why need I inform you of the many advantages which attend royalty, all of which you shall share with me, since you are well acquainted with them? If, however, you endeavour to resist from a desire to preserve your virtue, I will murder you, and then slay one of your slaves, and having laid both your bodies together, will state that I had caught you misbehaving with the slave and punished you to avenge the dishonour to my kinsman, so that your death will be attained with shame and reproach, and your body will be deprived both of burial and every other customary right. And as he kept urgently repeating his threats and entreaties, and swearing that he was speaking the truth as to each alternative, Lucretia, fearing the ignominy of the death he threatened, was forced to yield and to allow him to accomplish his desire. When it was day, Sextus, having gratified his wicked and baneful passion, returned to the camp, but Lucretia, overwhelmed with shame at what had happened, got into her carriage in all haste, dressed in black raiment, under which she had a dagger concealed, and set out for Rome, without saying a word to any person who saluted her when they met, or making any answer to those who wished to know what had befallen her, but continued thoughtful and downcast, with her eyes full of tears. When she came to her father's house, where some of his relations happened to be present, she threw herself at his feet, and, embracing his knees, wept for some time without uttering a word. And when he raised her up and asked her what had befallen her, she said, I have come to you as a supplicant, father, having endured terrible and intolerable outrages, and I beg you to avenge me, and not to overlook your daughters having suffered worse things than death. When her father as well as the others were struck with wonder at hearing this, and he asked her to tell who had outraged her and in what manner, she said, You will hear of my misfortunes very soon, father, but first grant me this favour I ask of you. Send for as many of your friends and kinsmen as you can, so that they may hear the report from me, the victim of terrible wrongs, rather than from others. And when you have learnt to what shameful and dire straits I was reduced, consult with them in what manner you will avenge both me and yourself, but do not let the time between be long. When in response to his hasty and urgent summons the most prominent men had come to his house, as she desired, she began at the beginning and told them all that had happened. Then, after embracing her father and addressing many entreaties both to him and to all present, and praying to the gods and other divinities to grant her a speedy departure from life, she drew the dagger she had kept concealed under her robes, and, plunging it into her heart, with a single stroke, died. Upon this, the woman beat their breasts, and filled the house with the shrieks and lamentations of women, but her father, enfolding her body in his arms, embraced it, and calling her by name again and again, ministered to her, as though she might recover from her wound, until in his arms, gasping and breathing out her life, she expired. This dreadful scene struck the Romans who were present with so much horror and compassion that they all cried out with one voice that they would rather die 1,000 deaths in defence of their liberty than suffer such outrages to be committed by the tyrants. There was among them a certain man called Publius Valerius, a descendant of one of those Sabines who came to Rome with Tatius, and a man of action and prudence. This man was sent by them to the camp both to acquaint the husband of Lucretia with what had happened, and with his aid to bring about a revolt of the army from the tyrants. He was no sooner outside the gates than he chanced to meet Collatinus, who was coming to the city from the camp, and knew nothing of the misfortunes that had befallen his household. And with him came Lucius Junius Brutus, which, translated into the Greek language, would be dullard. Concerning this man, since the Romans say that he was the prime mover of the expulsion of the tyrants, I must say a few words before continuing my account, to explain who he was, and of what descent, and for what reason he got his surname, which did not at all describe him. The father of Brutus was Marcus Junius, a descendant of one of the colonists in the company of Aeneas, and a man who, for his merits, was ranked among the most illustrious of the Romans. His mother was Tarquinia, a daughter of the first king Tarquinius. He himself enjoyed the best upbringing and education that his country afforded, and he had a nature not averse to any noble accomplishment. Tarquinius, after he had caused Tullius to be slain, put Junius' father also to death secretly, together with many other worthy men, not for any crime, but because he was in possession of the inheritance of an ancient family enriched by the good fortune of his ancestors, the spoils of which Tarquinius coveted, and together with his father he slew the elder son, who showed indications of a noble spirit unlikely to permit the deaths of his father to go unavenged. Thereupon Brutus, being still a youth and entirely destitute of all assistance from his family, undertook to follow the most prudent of all courses, which was to feign a stupidity that was not his, and he continued from that time to maintain this pretence of folly from which he acquired his surname, till he thought the proper time had come to throw it off. This saved him from suffering any harm at the hands of the tyrant, at a time when many good men were perishing, for Tarquinius, despising in him this stupidity, which was only apparent and not real, took all his inheritance from him, and allowing him a small maintenance for his daily support, kept him under his own authority, as an orphan who still stood in need of guardians, and permitted him to live with his own sons, not by way of honouring him as a kinsman, which was the pretence he made to his friends, but in order that Brutus, by saying mainly stupid things, and by acting the part of a real fool, might amuse the lads. And when he sent 2 of his sons, Aaron's and Titus, to consult the Delphic oracle concerning the plague, for some uncommon malady had in his reign descended upon both maids and boys, and many died of it, but it fell with the greatest severity without hope of cure upon women with child, destroying the mothers in travail together with their infants. Desiring to learn from the god both the cause of the disaster and the remedy for it, he sent Brutus along with the lads at their request, so that they might have somebody to laugh at and abuse. When the youths had come to the oracle and had received answers concerning the matter upon which they were sent, they made their offerings to the god, and laughed much at Brutus for offering a wooden staff to Apollo. In reality, he had secretly hollowed the whole length of it, like a tube, and inserted a rod of gold. After this they inquired of the god which of them was destined to succeed to the sovereignty of Rome, and the god answered, the one who should first kiss his mother. The youths, therefore, not knowing the meaning of the oracle, agreed to kiss their mother at the same time, desiring to possess the kingship jointly. But Brutus, understanding what the god meant, as soon as he landed in Italy, stooped to the earth and kissed it, looking upon that as the common mother of all mankind. Such then were the earliest events in the life of this man Brutus. On the occasion in question, when Brutus had heard Valerius relate all that had befallen Lucretia and describe her violent death, he lifted up his hands to heaven and said, O Jupiter and all ye gods who kept watch over the lives of men, has that time now come in expectation of which I have both keeping up this pretence in my manner of life? Has fate ordained that the Romans shall by me and through me be delivered from this intolerable tyranny? Having said this, he went in all haste to the house together with Collatinus and Valerius. When they came in, Collatinus, seeing Lucretia lying in the midst and her father embracing her, uttered a loud cry, and, throwing his arms about his wife's body, kept kissing her and calling her name and talking to her as if she had still been alive, for he was out of his mind by reason of his calamity. While he and her father were pouring forth their lamentations in turn, and the whole house was filled with wailing and mourning, Brutus, looking at them, said, You will have countless opportunities, Lucretius, Collatinus, and all of you who are kinsmen of this woman, to bewail her fate. But now let us consider how to avenge her, for that is what the present moment calls for. His advice seemed good, and sitting down by themselves and ordering the slaves and attendants to withdraw, they consulted together what they ought to do. And first Brutus began to speak about himself, telling them that what was generally believed to be his stupidity was not real, but only assumed, and informing them of the reasons which had induced him to submit to this pretence, whereupon they regarded him as the wisest of all men. Next, he endeavoured to persuade them all to be of one mind in expelling both Tarquinius and his sons from Rome, and he used many alluring arguments to this end. When he found that they were all of the same mind, he told them that what was needed was neither words nor promises but deeds, if any of the needful things were to be accomplished, and he declared days that he himself would take the lead in such deeds. Having said this, he took the dagger with which Lucretia had slain herself, and going to the body, for it still lay in view, a most piteous spectacle, he swore by Mars and all the other gods that he would do everything in his power to overthrow the domination of the Tarquini, and that he would neither be reconciled to the tyrant himself, nor tolerate any who should be reconciled to them, but would look upon every man who fought otherwise as his enemy, and until his death would pursue with unrelenting hatred both the tyrant and its abettors. And if he should violate his oath, he prayed that he and his children might meet with the same end as Lucretia. Having said this, he called upon all the rest also to take the same oath, and they, no longer hesitating, rose up and received the dagger from one another, and swore. After they had taken the oath, they at once considered in what manner they should go about their undertaking. And Brutus advised them as follows. First, let us keep the gates under guard, so that Tarquinius may have no intelligence of what is being said and done in the city against the tyranny until everything on our side is in readiness. After that, let us carry the body of this woman, stained as it is with blood, into the forum, and exposing it to the public view, call an assembly of the people. When they are assembled and we see the forum crowded, let Lucretius and Collatinus come forward and bewail their misfortunes after first relating everything that has happened. Next let each of the others come forward inveighing against the tyranny and summon the citizens to liberty. It will be what all Romans have devoutly wished if they see us, the patricians, making the first move on behalf of liberty, for they have suffered many dreadful wrongs at the hands of the tyrant and need but slight encouragement, and when we find the people eager to overthrow the monarchy, let us give them an opportunity to vote that Tarquinius shall no longer rule over the Romans, and let us send their decree to this effect to the soldiers in the camp in all haste. For when those who have arms in their hands hear that the whole city is alienated from the tyrant, they will become zealous for the liberty of their country, and will no longer as hitherto be restrained by bribes, or able to bear the insolent acts of the sons and flatterers of the Tarquins. After he had spoken thus, Valerius took up the discussion and said, "In other respects you seem to me to reason well, Junius, but concerning the assembly of the people, I wish to know further who is to summon it according to law and propose the vote to the Curia. For this is the business of a magistrate, and none of us holds a magistracy." To this Brutus answered, "I will, Valerius, for I am commander of the Celeres, and I have the power by law of calling an assembly of the people when I please. The tyrant gave me this most important magistracy in the belief that I was a fool and either would not be aware of the power attaching to it, or if I did recognize it, would not be able to use it. And I myself will deliver the first speech against the tyrant." Upon hearing this, they all applauded him for beginning with an honourable and lawful principle, and they asked him to tell the rest of his plans. And he continued, "Since you have resolved to follow this course, let us further consider what magistracy shall govern the commonwealth after the expulsion of the kings, and by what man it shall be created, and even before that, what form of government we shall establish as we get rid of the tyrant. For it is better to have considered everything before attempting so important an undertaking, and to have left nothing unexamined or unconsidered. Let each one of you accordingly declare his opinion concerning these matters." After this, many speeches were made by different men. Some were of the opinion that they ought to establish a monarchical government, and they recounted the great benefits the state had received from all the former kings. Others believed that they ought no longer to entrust the government to a single man, and they enumerated the tyrannical excesses which many other kings and Tarquinius last of all had committed against their own people. But they thought they ought to make the Senate supreme in all matters, according to the practice of many Greek cities. And still others liked neither of these forms of government, but advised them to establish a democracy like that at Athens. They pointed to the insolence and avarice of the few, and to the seditions usually stirred up by the lower classes against their superiors, and they declared that for a free commonwealth the equality of the citizens was of all forms of government the safest and the most becoming. The choice appearing to all of them difficult and hard to decide upon by reason of the evil attendant upon each form of government, Brutus took up the discussion as the final speaker and said, "It is my opinion, Lucretius, Collatinus, and all of you here present, good men yourselves and descended from good men, that we ought not in the present situation to establish any new form of government. For the time to which we are limited by the circumstances is short, so that it is not easy to reform the constitution of the state, and the very attempt to change it, even though we should happen to be guided by the very best counsels, is precarious and not without danger. And beside, it will be possible later, when we are rid of the tyranny, to deliberate with greater freedom and leisure, and thus choose a better form of government in place of a poor one, if indeed there is any constitution better than the one which Romulus, Pompilius, and all the succeeding kings instituted and handed down to us, by means of which our commonwealth has continued to be great and prosperous and to rule over many subjects. But as for the evils which generally attend monarchies, and because of which they degenerate into tyrannical cruelty, and are abhorred by all mankind, I advise you to correct these now, and at the same time to take precautions that they shall never again occur hereafter. And what are these evils? In the first place, since most people look at the names of things and influenced by them, either admit some that are hurtful or shrink from others that are useful, of which monarchy happens to be one, I advise you to change the name of the government and no longer to call those who shall have the supreme power over kings or monarchs, but to give them a more modest and humane title. In the next place, I advise you not to make one man's judgment the supreme authority over all, but to entrust the royal power to two men, as I am informed the Lacedaemonians have been doing now for many generations, in consequence of which form of government they are said to be the best governed and most prosperous people among the Greeks. For the rulers will be less arrogant and vexatious when the power is divided between two, and each has the same authority. Moreover, mutual respect, the ability of each to prevent the other from living as suits his pleasure, and a rivalry between them for the attainment of a reputation for virtue, would be most likely to result from such equality of power and honour. And insomuch as the insignia which have been granted to the kings are numerous, I believe that if any of these are grievous and invidious to the eyes of the multitude, we ought to modify some of them and abolish others. I mean, these sceptres and golden crowns, the purple and gold embroidered robes, unless it be upon certain festival occasions and in triumphal processions, when the rulers will assume them in honour of the gods, for they will offend no one if they are seldom used. But I think we ought to leave it to the men in the ivory chairs, in which they will sit in judgment, and also the white robe bordered with purple, together with the 12 axes to be carried before them when they appear in public. There is one thing more which, in my opinion, will be of great advantage, greater than all that I have mentioned, and the most effectual means of preventing those who shall receive this magistracy from committing many errors, and that is not to permit the same person to hold office for life, for a magistracy unlimited in time and not obliged to give any account of its actions is grievous to all and productive of tyranny, but to limit the power of the magistracy to a year, as the Athenians do. For this principle, by which the same person both rules and is ruled in turn and surrenders his authority before his mind has been corrupted, restrains arrogant dispositions and does not permit men's natures to grow intoxicated with power. If we establish these regulations, we should be able to enjoy all the benefits that flow from monarchy, and at the same time be rid of the evils that attend it. But to the end that the name too of the kingly power, which is traditional with us and made its way into our commonwealth with favourable auguries that manifested the approbation of the gods, may be preserved for form's sake, let there always be appointed a king of sacred rights, who shall enjoy the honour for life exempt from all military and civil duties, and, like the king at Athens, exercising this single function, the superintendence of the sacrifices, and no other. In what manner each of these measures shall be effected I will now tell you. I will summon the assembly, as I said, since this power is accorded me by law, and will propose this resolution, that Tarquinius be banished with his wife and children, and that they and their posterity as well be forever debarred both from the city and from the Roman territory. After the citizens have passed this vote, I will explain to them the form of government we propose to establish. Next, I will choose an interrex to appoint the magistrates who are to take over the administration of public affairs, and I will then resign the command of the Selares. Let the interrex appoint be me, call together the centuriate assembly, and having nominated the persons who are to hold the annual magistracy, let him permit the citizens to vote upon them, and if the majority of the centuries are in favour of ratifying his choice of man, and the auguries concerning them are favourable, let these men assume the axes and the other insignia of royalty, and see to it that our country shall enjoy its liberty, and that the Tarquini shall never more return. for they will endeavour, be assured, by persuasion, violence, fraud, and every other means to get back into power unless we are upon our guard against them. These are the most important and essential matters that I have to propose to you at present and to advise you to adopt. As for the details, which are many and not easy to examine with precision at the present time, for we are brought to an acute crisis, I think we leave them to the men themselves who are to take over the magistracy. But I do say that these magistrates ought to consult with the Senate in everything as the kings formerly did, and to do nothing without your advice, and that they ought to lay before the people the decrees of the Senate according to the practice of our ancestors, depriving them of none of the privileges which they possessed in earlier times, for thus their magistracy will be most secure and most excellent. After Junius Brutus had delivered this opinion, they all approved it, and straightway consulting about the persons who were to take over the magistracies, they decided that Spurius Lucretius, the father of the woman who had killed herself, will be appointed interrex, and that Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus should be nominated by him to exercise the power of the kings, and they ordered that these magistrates should be called in their language consuls. This, translated into the Greek language, may signify councillors, pre-councillors, or councils. But in the course of time they came to be called by the Greek hypatoi, or supreme, from the greatness of their power, because they command all the citizens and have the highest rank. For the ancients called that which was outstanding and superlative hypaton. Having discussed and settled these matters, they besought the gods to assist them in the pursuit of their holy and just aims, and they went to the forum. They were followed by their slaves, who carried upon a bier spread with black cloth the body of Lucretia, unprepared for burial and stained with blood, and directing them to place it in a high and conspicuous position before the Senate House, they called an assembly of the people. When a crowd had gathered, not only of those who were in the forum at the time, but also of those who came from all parts of the city, for the heralds had gone through the streets to summon the people thither, Brutus ascended the tribunal, from which it was the custom of those who assembled the people to address them, and having placed the patricians near them, spoke as follows: Citizens, I am going to speak to you upon urgent matters of general interest. I desire first to say a few words about myself, for by some perhaps, or more accurately, as I know by many of you, I shall be thought to be disordered in my intellect when I, a man of unsound mind, attempt to speak upon matters of the greatest importance. A man who, as being not mentally sound, has need of guardians. Know then that the general opinion you all entertain of me as a fool was false and contrived by me and me alone. That which compelled me to live not as by my nature demanded, or as beseeched me, but as was agreeable to Tarquinius, and seemed likely to be to my own advantage, was the fear I felt for my life. For my father was put to death by Tarquinius upon his ascension to the sovereignty, in order that he might possess himself of his property, which was very considerable, and my elder brother, who would have avenged his father's death if he had not been put out of the way, was secretly murdered by the tyrant. Nor was it clear that he would spare me either, now left destitute of his nearest relations, if I had not pretended a folly that was not genuine. This fiction, finding credit with the tyrant, saved me from the same treatment that they had given to my family members, and has preserved me to this day. But since the time has come at last, which I have prayed for and looked forward to, I am now laying it aside for the time, and after maintaining it for 25 years, am no longer concealing my intellect, so much concerning myself. The state of public affairs, because of which I have called you together, is this: insomuch as Tarquinius neither obtained the sovereignty in accordance with our ancestral customs and laws, nor, since he obtained it, in whatever manner he got it, has been exercising it in an honourable or kingly manner, but has surpassed in insolence and lawlessness all the tyrants the world ever saw, we patricians met together and resolved to deprive him of his power, a thing we ought to have done long ago, but are doing now when a favourable opportunity has offered. And we have called you together, plebeians, in order to declare our own decision, and then ask you for your assistance in achieving liberty for our country, a blessing which we ought hitherto have been able to enjoy since Tarquinius obtained the sovereignty, for nor shall hereafter we be able to enjoy it if we show weakness now. Had I as much time as I could wish, or were I about to speak to men unacquainted with the facts, I should have enumerated all the lawless deeds of the tyrant for which he deserves to die, not once but many times, at the hands of all. But since the time permitted me by the circumstances is so short, and in this brief time there is little that needs to be said, but much needs to be done, and since I am speaking to those who are acquainted with the facts, I shall remind you merely of those of his deeds that are most heinous and the most conspicuous, and do not admit of any excuse. This is that Tarquinius citizens who, before he took over the sovereignty, destroyed his own brother Aaron's by poison because he would not consent to become wicked, in which abominable crime he was assisted by his brother's wife, the sister of his own wife, whom this enemy of the gods had even long before debauched. This is the man who, on the same days and with the same poisons, killed his wedded wife, a virtuous woman who had also been the mother of his children by him, and did not even deign to clear himself of the blame for both these poisonings and make it appear that they were not his work, by assuming a mourning garb and some slight pretence of grief, nay, close upon the heels of his committing these monstrous deeds, and before the funeral pyre which had received those miserable bodies had died away, he gave a banquet to his friends celebrating his nuptials, and led the murderess of her husband as a bride to the bed of her sister, thus fulfilling the abominable contract he had made with her, and being the first and the only man who ever introduced into the city of Rome such impious and execrable crimes unknown to any nation in the world, either Greek or barbarian. And how infamous and dreadful, plebeians, were the crimes he committed against both his parent-in-law when they were already in the sunset of their lives. Servius Tullius, the most excellent of your kings and your greatest benefactor, he openly murdered and would not permit his body to be honoured with either the funeral or the burial that were customary. And Tarquinia, the wife of Tullius, whom, as she was the sister of his father, and had always shown great kindness to him, it was fitting that he should honour as a mother, he destroyed, unhappy woman, by the noose, without allowing her time to mourn her husband under the sod, and to perform the customary sacrifices for him. Thus he treated those by whom he had been preserved, by whom he had been reared, and whom, after their death, he was to have succeeded if he had waited but a short time, until death had come to them in the course of nature. But why do I censure these crimes committed against his relations and his kin by marriage, when, apart from them, I have so many other unlawful acts of which to accuse him, which he has committed against his country and against all of us, if indeed they ought to be called merely unlawful acts, and not rather the subversion and extinction of all that is sanctioned by our laws and customs. Take, for instance, the sovereignty, to begin with that. How did he obtain it? Did he follow the example of the former kings? Far from it. The others were all advanced to the sovereignty by you, according to our ancestral customs and laws, first by a decree of the Senate, which body has been given the right to deliberate first concerning all public affairs, next by the appointment of interexes, whom the Senate entrusts with the selection of the most suitable man from among those who are worthy of the sovereignty, after that by a vote of the people in the comitia, by which vote the law requires that all matters of the greatest moment shall be ratified, and last of all, by the appropriation of the auguries, sacrificial victims, and other signs, without which human diligence and foresight would be of no avail. Well then, which of these things does any one of you know to have been done when Tarquinius was obtaining the sovereignty? What preliminary decree of the Senate was there? What decision on the part of the interexes? What vote of the people? What favourable auguries? I do not ask whether all these formalities were observed, though it was necessary, if all was to be well, that nothing founded either in custom or in law should have been omitted. But if it can be shown that any one of them was observed, I am content not to quibble about these that were omitted. How then did he come to the sovereignty? By arms, by violence, and by the conspiracies of wicked men, according to the custom of tyrants, in spite of your disapproval and indignation. Well, but after he had obtained the sovereignty, in whatever manner he got it, did he use it in a fashion becoming a king, in imitation of his predecessors, whose words and actions were invariably such that they handed down the city to their successors more prosperous and greater than they themselves had received it? When man in his senses could say so, when he sees to what a pitiable and wretched state we all have been brought by him. I shall say nothing of the calamities we who are patricians have suffered, of which no one even of our enemies could hear without tears, since we are left but few out of many, having been brought low from having been exalted, and have come to poverty and dire want after being stripped of many enviable possessions. Of all these illustrious men, those great and able leaders, because of whom our city was once distinguished, some have been put to death and others banished. But what is your condition, plebeians? Has not Tarquinius taken away your laws? Has he not abolished your assemblages for the performance of religious rites and sacrifices? Has he not put an end to your electing of magistrates, to your voting, and to your meeting in the assembly to discuss public affairs? Does he not force you like slaves purchased with money to endure shameful hardships in quarrying stone, hewing timber, carrying burdens, and wasting your strength in deep pits and caverns, without allowing you the least respite from your miseries? What then will be the limit of our calamities? For when shall we recover the liberty our fathers enjoyed? When Tarquinius dies, to be sure, and how shall we be in a better condition then? Why should it not be worse? For we shall have 3 Tarquini sprung from that one, all far more abominable than their sire. For when one who from a private situation has become a tyrant and has begun late to be wicked is an expert in all tyrannical mischief, what kind of men may we expect those to be who are sprung from him, whose parentage has been depraved, whose nurture has been depraved, and who never had an opportunity of seeing or hearing anything done with the moderation befitting free citizens, in order therefore that you may not merely guess at their accursed natures, but may know with certainty what kinds of whelps the tyranny of Tarquinius is secretly rearing up for your destruction. Behold the deed of one of them, the eldest of the 3. This woman is the daughter of Spurius Lucretius, whom the tyrant, when he went to war, appointed prefect of the city, and the wife of Tarquinius Collatinus, a kinsman of the tyrant, who has undergone many hardships for their sake. Yet this woman, who desired to preserve her virtue and loved her husband as becomes a good wife, could not, when Sextus was entertained last night at her house, as a kinsman and Collatinus was absent at the time in camp, escape the unbridled insolence of a tyranny, but like a captive constrained by necessity, had to submit to indignities that it is not right any woman of free condition should suffer. Resenting this treatment and looking upon the outrage as intolerable, she related to her father and the rest of her kinsmen the straits to which she had been reduced, and after earnestly entreating and adjuring them to avenge the wrongs she had suffered, she drew out the dagger she had concealed under the folds of her dress and, before her father's very eyes, plebeians, plunged the steel into her vitals. O admirable woman, and worthy of great praise for your noble resolution, you are gone, you are dead, being unable to hear the tyrant's insolence, and despairing of all the pleasures of life in order to avoid suffering any such indignity again. After this example, Lucretia, when you, who were given a woman's nature, have shown the resolution of a brave man, shall we, who were born men, show ourselves inferior to women in courage? To you, because you had been deprived by force of your spotless chastity, by submission to a tyrant during one night, death appeared sweeter and more blessed than life, and shall not the same feeling sway us, whom Tarquinius, by a tyranny, and of one day only, but of 25 years, has deprived of all the pleasures of life in depriving us of all our liberty? Life is intolerable to us plebeians when we wallow amid such wretchedness. To us who are the descendants of those men who thought themselves worthy to give laws to others and exposed themselves to many dangers for the sake of power and fame. Nay, but we must all choose one of two things, life with liberty or death with glory. An opportunity has come such as we have been praying for. Tarquinius is absent from the city, the patricians are the leaders of the enterprise, and naught will be lacking for us if we enter upon the undertaking with zeal. Neither men, money, arms, generals, nor any other equipment of warfare, for the city is full of all of these, and it would be disgraceful if we, who aspire to rule the Volscians, the Sabines, and countless other peoples, should ourselves submit to be slaves of others, and should undertake many wars to gratify the ambition of Tarquinius, but not one to recover our own liberty. What resources, therefore, what assistance shall we have for our undertaking? For this remains to be discussed. First, there are the hopes we place in the gods, whose rites, temples, and altars Tarquinius pollutes with hands stained with blood, and defiled with every kind of crime against his own people, every time he begins the sacrifices and libations. Next, there are the hopes that we place in ourselves, who are neither few in number nor unskilled in war. Beside these advantages, there are the forces of our allies, who, so long as they are not called upon by us, will not presume to busy themselves with our affairs, but if they see us acting the part of brave men, will gladly assist us in this war, for tyranny is odious to all who desire to be free. But if any of you are afraid that the citizens who are in the camp with Tarquini will assist him and make war upon us, these fears are groundless, for the tyranny is grievous to them also, and the desire of liberty is implanted by nature in the minds of all men, and every excuse for a change is sufficient for those who are compelled to bear hardships. And if you by your votes order them to come to the aid of their country, neither fear nor favour nor any of the other motives that compel or persuade men to commit injustice will keep them with the tyrants. But if, by reason of an evil nature or a bad upbringing, the love of tyranny is after all rooted in some of them, though surely they are not many, we will bring strong compulsion to bear upon these men too, so that they will become good citizens instead of bad. For we have as hostages for them in the city their children, wives, and parents, who are dearer to every man than their own life. By promising to restore these to them if they will desert the tyranny, and by passing a vote of amnesty for the mistakes they have made, we shall easily prevail upon them to join us. Advance to the struggle, therefore, plebeians, with confidence and with good hopes for the future, for this war which you are about to undertake is the most glorious of all the wars you have ever waged. Ye gods of our ancestors, kind guardians of this land, and you other divinities, to whom the care of our fathers was allotted, and thou city, dearest to the gods of all cities, the city in which we received our birth and nurture, we shall defend you with our counsels, our words, our hands, and our lives, and we are ready to suffer everything that heaven and fate shall bring. And I predict that our glorious endeavours will be crowned with success. May all here present, emboldened by the same confidence and united in the same sentiments, both preserve us and be preserved by us. While Brutus was thus addressing the people, everything he said was received by them with continual acclamations, signifying both their approval and their encouragement. Most of them even wept with pleasure at hearing these wonderful and unexpected words, and various emotions, in no wise resembling one another, afflicted the minds of each of the hearers. For pain was mingled with pleasure, the former arising from the terrible experiences that were past, and the latter from the blessing that was anticipated, and anger went hand in hand with fear, the former encouraging them to despise their own safety in order to injure the objects of their hatred, while the latter, occasioned by the thought of the difficulty of overthrowing the tyranny, inspired them with reluctance towards the enterprise. But when he had done speaking, they all cried out, as from a single mouth, to lead them to arms. Then Brutus, pleased at this, said, "On this condition, that you first hear the resolution of the Senate and confirm it. For we have resolved that the Tarquini and all their posterity shall be banished both from the city of Rome and from all the territory ruled by the Romans, and no one shall be permitted to say or do anything about their restoration, and that if anyone shall be found to be working contrary to these decisions, he shall be put to death. If it is your pleasure that this resolution be confirmed, divide yourself into your curia and give your votes, and let the enjoyment of this right be the beginning of your liberty." This was done, and all the curia having given their votes for the banishment of the tyrants, Brutus again came forward and said, "Now that our first measures have been confirmed in this manner required, hear also what we have further resolved concerning the form of our government. It was our decision, upon considering what magistracy should be in control of affairs, not to establish the kingship again, but to appoint 2 annual magistrates to hold royal power. These men to be whomever you yourselves shall choose in the comitia, voting by centuries. If therefore this also is your pleasure, give your vote to that effect." The people approved of this resolution likewise, not by a single vote, being against it. After that, Brutus, coming forward, appointed Spurius Lucretius as Intrex to preside over the comitia for the election of the magistrates according to ancestral custom, and he, dismissing the assembly, ordered all the people to go promptly in arms to the field where it was their custom to elect their magistrates. When they were come thither, he chose 2 men to perform the functions which had belonged to the kings, Brutus and Collatinus, and the people, being called by centuries, confirmed their appointment. Such were the measures taken in the city at this time. As soon as King Tarquinius heard by the first messengers who had found means to escape from the city before the gates were shut that Brutus was holding the assembled people enthralled, haranguing them and summoning the citizens to liberty, which was all the information they could give him, he took with him his sons and the most trustworthy of his friends, and without communicating his design to any others, rode at full gallop in hopes of forestalling the revolt. But finding the gates shut and the battlements full of armed men, he returned to the camp as speedily as possible, bewailing and complaining of his misfortunes. But his cause there also was now lost. For the consuls, foreseeing that he would quickly come to the city, had sent letters by other roads to those in the camp, in which they exhorted them to revolt from the tyrant and acquainted them with the resolutions passed by those in the city. Titus Herminius and Marcus Horatius, who had been left by the king to command in his absence, having received these letters, read them in an assembly to the soldiers, and asking them by their centuries what they thought should be done, when it was their unanimous opinion to regard the decision reached by those in the city as valid, they no longer would admit Tarquinius when he returned. After the king found himself disappointed of his hope also, he fled with a few companions to the city of Gabii, over which, as I said before, he had appointed Sextus, the eldest of his sons, to be king. He was now grown grey with age and had reigned 25 years. In the meantime, Herminius and Horatius, having made a truce with the Ardates for 15 years, led their forces home.